Hey. Copy streaming link.
That's annoying. That's super annoying.
Okay. Welcome, viewers, to
Chaz, your audio is super hot.
I put the auto.
Oh wow! Are you definitely running through your mic?
I'm recording.
Yep. I can set it back down to the fixed level. How's that? Stu?
What?
That's me fixing the level as opposed to doing automatic level control.
Weird. Okay. It worked fine for me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I'm just trying
But is that a good volume? Like, is that a good level?
No, I could do with it being quieter, please.
I'm down to like 5%.
Okay. It could be a problem on my end then. If it sounds fine to Mel, then it sounds fine to Mel.
It does actually. I mean, it doesn't sound like he's peaking at least.
Boop, 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 boop.
Give me 2 secs. This is going to be annoying.
Hello, viewers, especially new viewers. We are sorting ourselves out and we'll be starting.
This is what happens every live stream. And thankfully, not just us.
It's a bit annoying because the YouTube video is behind. Like, wait. Maybe it's
20 seconds behind.
Yeah, okay.
Where's the link, Stu?
You can just get it from YouTube. That's where I get it from.
It's if you click up on the live on YouTube thing on the Zoom up in the corner, it says copy streaming link or view stream on YouTube.
No, that would be the Zoom link, not the YouTube one.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
No, when I pasted it onto Twitter, it was.
Oh, okay. Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's the YouTube one.
Cool. Well, that's something.
All right, I've let the Patreons know.
Right, I'm taking this off because it's fogging my glasses and fucking with my mic. So double loss.
Yeah, that's. What the hell happened there? Okay.
All right.
You know, I said we didn't need to do a test for the keynote because I tested it the day with you guys. No,
Famous last words.
Famous last words. When I run the keynote on even if the presenter display is off with 2 displays, it still darkens the Zoom display. So I've had to just export it to a PowerPoint, which is going to ruin a lot of our beautiful formatting, but we'll just have to live with it. And but at least I can. Just a shame because the collaboration was actually working really well, the real-time collaboration.
Hello, Chris Walker.
Did he just reply?
He's in the YouTube chat.
Okay, cool.
So many chats.
We just stay on so Mel, what we do is just basically hang out on the live chat.
Yeah.
On the YouTube channel.
Of the YouTube channel. Okay, cool.
Cool. All right. This is why we'll end up just cutting this down and releasing it. Okay, cool.
All right.
Now I can do this because it's fun. Hey.
I had to kill full screen mode with fire.
Yeah, I got to get out of that so I can see the Trello.
Yeah, okay.
If I don't have my Trello, I'll be lost. All right.
So much for it looping. Oh, great. That means all its little loops have not carried across to PowerPoint.
Stu, are you able to record my audio on your end as well as a backup?
Yes, it does.
Okay,
it actually gives us separate
channels.
It gives us separate channels.
Okay,
Okay.
great. Cool. Then I'm
All
sorted.
right.
I got coffee, booze. Well, coffee, booze, me. That's it.
I'm recording for GarageBand.
Yep, I'm recording in GarageBand, so we're good. So I think we've only got, we got 9 listeners. So thank you for joining us and putting up with the fun to start. I guess the original idea of the bandanas was to get us into the Watchmen theme, but I can also do this. I was going to bring my fencing mask, but then I would have to take it on my bike. And now I've decided what I want to do with my fencing mask is paint it blue and then put the little hydrogen thing there and then the Dr. Manhattan eyes. So when I get back to fencing, who cares about Mandalorian? I want to do Dr. Manhattan.
Pretty bad.
All right. So okay, cool. We can go now.
Who starts? I'll start because you've got to. Yeah. Hi, I'm Chaz Fisher.
And I'm Stu Willis.
And welcome to Draft Zero, a podcast where, in this instance, 2 Aussie and 1 American filmmaker try to work out what makes great screenplays work.
Well, actually, let's introduce Mel first. You may hopefully remember Melanie from, it isn't an ISO theme, Stephanie. The putting on the masks. We're introducing Melanie. You may remember from our Star Wars episode. We had a lot of fun, and she's obviously she's more geeky than the 2 of us. And has all the real knowledge. So we thought we'd bring her on to discuss Watchmen, the comic, the movie, the TV show, before Watchmen, the Doomsday Clock, all of the things. Actually, we're not going to do all of the things. We're just going to do the main ones.
Yeah. And so, as always, these live streams are a looser, perhaps less thought through version than our standard classic podcasts. So welcome to all the new viewers that might be coming in, particularly those from the Script Pipeline Writers Mixer. But as much as I say looser and less thought through, I think Mel and Stu have not slept for the past 3 days and have just spent the entire time ransacking the comic, the film, and the TV show for stills to talk about.
Because essentially, I think it comes down to why were we interested in doing Watchmen? And we brought it up in the Star Wars episode, which is again why we thought about with Melanie. And we thought, the quote unquote fan service in the Watchmen TV show was very good. But what actually really was that we felt it was a more successful adaptation of the source material, the comic, than the movie was. So really our overarching kind of theme for this show is, well, it's adaptation, right? And what you have to take into consideration of adaptation just through the lens of Watchmen. And what we see it as doing in the show in terms of what it's taken from the show narratively on a craft level, thematic level, on a story level, and used in developing the material separately from how Zack Snyder and his team adapted the comic. So I guess we got to name our biases up front. In that, it's not like I got to message someone saying it's the worst film I've ever seen. For me, it's not the worst film I've ever seen, but I was disappointed with it. And my memory of seeing the Watchmen movie was in the prison scene, an audience clapping when Rorschach killed a bunch of the bad guys. And I'm like, are we what? And I realized that we weren't watching the same film. I was bringing the baggage of the comic to the movie. Having now rewatched the movie, I think the movie is more aligned with their viewpoints. And so it's also, I guess, adaptation is related to tone and theme. And that tone is an elusive concept. And when we get to the overly complicated screenwriting diagram, we'll talk a little bit about that. And it's also, I guess, the other reason that I wanted to talk about Watchmen, and I think you guys probably agree, is it is actually material. All 3 versions of this that we're talking about have something to say, right? Theme is like being political in a small p sense of the word, is a very core part of what they're trying to do. And so in terms of analyzing theme and tone and the interrelationship of those and how they relate to character, they're really good things to kind of pick apart.
Yeah. And I would say, I think we're going to have a whole lot of people who might tune into this because they love all versions of Watchmen. But for those of you who've happened to stumble on the podcast and have had zero access to any piece of the Watchmen, as a bit of culture, don't worry, because I think what we are getting into from a screenwriting perspective is not just about adaptation. It's actually by us being able to see these different versions, we can see the choices the writers have made. And we'll get to Stu's pretty remarkable diagram that we all drunkenly argued about the other night. But
I like how Chaz has never met anything he can't have an opinion on in like 1 second. So I start doing it and we're screen sharing on over Zoom. And of course he's like, move it to the left. No, it's in the wrong spot. No, up, left. Oh God.
The more we drank, the more complicated the diagram got. So that should tell everyone something.
It got really simple for a moment. Like
it started off as a triangle, and now it's triangles within triangles. It's very fractal, but we're not going to show it yet.
But the broad point that I'm trying to make eventually is that even in writing a brand new screenplay without any sort of pre-existing IP or given circumstances of the world, it's going to be a story of, or this podcast will hopefully explore the decisions that the writer has to make in terms of ordering how the audience experiences, the actions of the characters, the motivations of the characters, the tone, the theme, those choices. And because we've got such a wealth of information here in terms of having how Alan Moore made those choices versus how Zack Snyder made those choices versus how Damon Lindelof and the extended writers room and directors of the show made those choices, what we can do is actually take away from that lessons for our own writing and go, oh, this is how I can control the audience's experience of my story differently.
That's a great summation, and now we're going to ramble about it for
as long as the time of Monsters Inc., which is what my kids are watching downstairs.
You haven't put it on loop?
No, I'm using a DVD because I don't want them using the internet bandwidth.
Oh, but I'm pretty sure you used to be able to put DVDs on loop in my day.
Okay.
All right, cool. So should we kind of get into it?
Absolutely.
At least summarize. I think the good place to start is to summarize the comic, the movie, and the show in terms of the story, because they are interconnected. Yet there is some significant, not significant, but they've made a significant choice in what we'll go into. One of these things that's called given circumstances, to use the term, that they made that makes the show more connected to the comic. And obviously, from this point forward, I guess, spoiler alert, extraordinarily. I know my parents wanted to kind of tune in, but they haven't finished watching the HBO show, and I had to post my mum my copy of the Watchmen comic so she can read it. Behind. All right, so this is the summary of the movie, and I think what's interesting about that I found on IMDb. Thanks, T-Han. What I think is interesting about the synopsis that they've written for the movie is it's actually substantially similar to what I would say is a synopsis of the comic. We don't necessarily have to read through the whole thing. But what's interesting about this one, just from a screenwriting point of view, is they set the world about, alternative 1985 America. There's a doomsday clock, tensions between the USA and Soviet Union. And against that backdrop, a masked vigilante called the Comedian is killed, and a vigilante called Rorschach starts to investigate the murder, right? In the comic, the cops that have looked at it basically decide to drop the case, that they're not going to go into it, not because they know that the character is the comedian, but because they know he's connected or believe he's connected to the government. So they just don't want to touch it, which motivates Rorschach in the further. In the movie, it's more that the cops are not sure what's going on, and it kind of just disappears from the plot line. But that is the driving narrative in both the film and the book, is Rorschach investigating this murder. And then that basically means he goes and reconnects with his former crime fighting, like legions, his former crime fighting buddies, a ragtag group of retired superheroes, the Night Owl too, Silk Spectre. We'll go through these characters, Manhattan. We meet them through him, and we learn about their past. And then basically he starts to see a conspiracy about their shared past and catastrophic consequences for the future. You know, that is the story of both the show and not the show. Well, in some ways it's the show. Sorry, it's both the movie and the comic. I think they're substantially similar, though there's a key plot point which we'll come to shortly. In terms of the TV show, this is the HBO synopsis for it. Set in an alternate history where masked vigilantes are treated as outlaws, Watchmen embraces the nostalgia of the original groundbreaking novel, the same name, while attempting to break new ground on its own. But who is watching the Watchmen? It's like, okay, they use the theme that's in the title, the titular title. This is a more complicated one that I don't know if we need to necessarily break this down in detail now, because it's obviously very long and just us reading it. But what is interesting, this is one that we found on Wikipedia, is that it actually spent a lot of the synopsis summarizing the state of the world.
Yeah.
Because I think ultimately the TV show is very similar in that there is a murder that a character who is a masked vigilante, but in the context of the world is a legal one. Whereas, so they're not a vigilante at all then, a masked police officer. Whereas in the
I'd argue he's both. And that we know at the beginning he's a legal one, and we find out later that he.
You're talking about the murder. Yes, I was actually talking about Sister Knight, but effectively she. Yeah. I mean,
she's sort of left the force as well. So she started as a legal one and is not, as is sort of established. And I think that they are really intentionally playing with that line with both her and Captain Crawford in terms of they try to have it both ways.
Yeah, and there kind of is a connection between the three characters. So what I think we might do now, just to kind of reorientate everyone, including ourselves, let's quickly run through the gallery of the cast of characters so we're reminded who everyone is. Because unlike the podcast, we can't sit there and search Wikipedia for a minute, remind ourselves, and then edit that. Well, not us edit out, Chris edited it out. So this is kind of this preparation.
Chris, I really miss you, by the way, just so you know.
Yeah, if any could. Okay, so cast of characters. This I'm using images. We're using images from the comic and the movie and the show because there's a clear connection. So this is the original group of the Watchmen.
Except you've written Night Owl over Silk Spectre.
Oops. Yeah. I'm actually okay. Cool. Can I've got the annotation tools. That's wrong. That's just because I've copy and pasted it at like 3 a.m. All right. So by Silk Spectre, Dr. Manhattan, Night Owl, and Rorschach. And what is interesting in terms of the show, if you've seen it, is that all of these characters have except Night Owl. He's crying because he's got he's basically, except for the appearance of his ship and his technology, he has no presence in the show. But these are the key characters in the movie, and this is clear all drawings. Okay, and this is how they appeared in the movie. And the comedian is I guess because he's murdered. He has no role in the TV show either. And what's interesting is I don't think he casts a shadow on the world of the given circumstances of America portrayed in the Watchmen TV show in the way that he is such a shadow over the world of the comic.
Yeah.
All right. And okay, there's these other key characters of which we're going to learn that are really important. They're the predecessors to the Watchmen superhero group, and they're called the Minutemen, right?
To put it in broad context, like the Minutemen were like 30s and 40s, the Watchmen were like 60s and 70s. Then the story of the Watchmen graphic novel, as we're watching it unfurl, is actually in the 80s after the Watchmen have been outlawed. And then we have the Watchmen TV show, which is set, 2010s, almost 2020, but as an extension of that timeline.
And it's set in majority 2019, but it flashes back throughout everything. I think it flashes back through like the last 80 years, including touching on a couple of the things that both the novel and the events prior to the novel, the novel and the novel's flashbacks. So many flashbacks, and they're all the actual structure is really fascinating, and how they toy with that, which I know we'll get to.
I mean, what they've managed to do with the Watchmen TV show, the HBO show, is by having one of the main characters be Hooded Justice, who you can see wearing the noose around his neck. They've managed to tie the TV show back to the comic in a really powerful way.
Yeah, so this is the, and what is interesting is the Hooded Justice has a couple of plot roles. Does he have any kind of plot significance other than interfering between the comedian's attempted rape of the original Silk Spectre? Does he have any other kind of significant role?
Other than he was the first.
Yeah. Okay. So he was considered the first of the costume vigilantes, costume heroes entirely, right? So that's an important factor, right? And obviously the fact that he wears a hood is an important factor if you've seen the show, and hopefully you have seen the show because you understand why that's important. This is them, they're recreating that shot, how that translates over to the movie. The only other character that kind of really plays a significant part in the TV show that comes over from the Minutemen is it Metropolis? Is that
Captain
his name?
Metropolis.
Captain Metropolis, which is this guy here, right? Because there was an insinuation in the comic book anyway, wasn't there, about the sexuality of Hooded Justice and his relationship with.
Oh, I don't think it was an insinuation. It was like out in the open.
Oh,
it's in Hollis Mason's book, and Silk Spectre, who's in between them there, also talks about it. Like, she gets interviewed somewhere as to why the lesbian character who's on your left of screen, I can't remember her
Silhouette.
Silhouette. She gets kicked out of the Minutemen for being gay, and Silk Spectre later comments like, it wasn't fair that we kicked her out for being gay while we openly knew that there were other gay characters within the Minutemen.
So there's definitely this moral puritanical streak. I mean, it's reflective of an era, but when we talk about a little bit about Rorschach as a key to like Rorschach's character and ultimately the Seventh Cavalry, that kind of puritanical idea, which is what Lindelof brought out, is kind of intersects with, white supremacy. So this, so that the Minutemen in a weird way are the kind of, we'll get to it.
Yeah.
So this is the characters in the TV show. So we've got kind of Tulsa Police. We've got Sister Night, Angela Abar, who's our main point of view character. So she's the one who starts investigating the murder mystery. And in a way, she is Night Owl. She's kind of a bit Night Owl-ish meets Rorschach. She doesn't have that kind of moral fortitude of Rorschach, but she's the primary investigator. Her husband, Cal Abar, becomes very significant. I mean, let's just spoil it now if you haven't, why are you still listening if you don't want to be spoiled? Calvin, as it turns out, the main plot twist is when a god walks into Abar. I should have dropped in the image because Cal, as it turns out, is a body that houses a vessel for Dr. Manhattan. Doesn't know he's Dr. Manhattan. Okay, Judd Crawford is the police detective of the chief of police in Tulsa, who is murdered at the end of the first episode. And the other main kind of police investigating character is Looking Glass, who in many ways is again, very deliberately recalls Rorschach, right? Both in terms of look, the fact that he wears this stretched over mask, but I'm also the fact that he's kind of like a skinny guy. And that also is really interesting because
skinny guy with some very specific trauma in his past. Yeah. I think both of their backstories are very intentional in terms of that intergenerational trauma and having something happen to them when they were quite young. He was a Jehovah's Witness, and Rorschach also has this really explicit pseudo moral code. There's several clear parallels.
Oh, and also the fact that they are the two characters who don't compromise no matter what.
Do you think that's what?
Well,
Wade, he has, I don't know how much to get ahead of it, but Wade, his journey in the whole film, he's a cop, right, in the whole TV show. And at a certain point, he's been traumatized by the squids landing in New York, and that sends out a psychic wave of terror and anguish. And he wears his looking glass mask, we find out later, not to scare other people, but because he feels safe within it, that it's made of a material that's supposed to protect you from these psychic attacks. And when all of that, the squid attack is revealed to be a giant hoax that was planned by a human being, that there are no aliens, that he doesn't need to expect any more psychic attacks, he just still recommits to his persona and his ideals anyway.
Okay. All right. No, I'll play that. I think it's interesting because for me, it was partly about them playing with my sympathies, because I'm not someone who likes Rorschach as a character and thinks the comic is very deliberately setting him up as a hypocritical, violent, basically like a small f fascist, do what I say, not what I do, authoritarian. That I kind of wasn't sure how I was to think about Looking Glass, which they use against me. Like, the show is very clever in making you not sure whether the Looking Glass is a member of the Seventh Cavalry or sympathetic to them. And then they actually show you that he isn't, which is a great thing, but they kind of use his echoiness of Rorschach against you.
And they've cast Tim Blake Nelson.
Like, deliberately.
They've cast this lovable, affable teddy bear of a man.
The casting of the show is impeccable. It's just... Yeah. I was thinking that last night, from Jeremy Irons to and really they are playing a lot with what we know of these characters' past roles. I think we'll get with Judd Crawford casting essentially Nash Bridges is a really interesting choice. I mean, I don't know how much that transferred over to Australia, but like Nash Bridges, you've got this cop who's got like a dirty streak, but he's very much that noirish sort of guy. He's very sort of over the top, and he is, does the wrong thing to do right, and sleeps around and has all of these other things. So this is essentially taking that character and showing him years down the road, playing the political game, more mature, etc. Like, it really knows what it's doing with all of its casting in terms of drawing on the history of a lot of these actors, including specifically Cal casting somebody who was fairly unknown and playing that up against Regina King, who is just an absolute legend, which is really fascinating.
Yeah.
Just to bring us back to the end of Judd, I just found that image from the show. So you can that's where Judd ends up.
By the end of the first.
By the end of the first act, right? Yeah. And obviously that, as we learn, the symbolism of this guy being hooded justice and him actually hanging a police officer by the tree. But obviously the imagery of a black man being under the lynching, the hanging of a tree of a white man is obviously very strong. And it's kind of the imagery that the show is playing for.
Yeah. So, where do we want to leap into this analysis? Given Circumstances is next on the Trello, and given we've had to give a lot of background, it's indicative of just how much, given circumstances, we have to provide just to talk about this podcast.
Well, I think there's real quick before we get to the given circumstance, I think just touching on and maybe making more explicit the way that we're talking, like, if we look at the way that all three of these mediums treat the same event, I think that tells us a lot about what they're trying to say. So if you look at the way that they treat the murder, which is the inciting incident, in the graphic novel, the cops are essentially like, we're going to write this off. There's a mystery. We're not going to, we know that it's murder. Don't actually give a shit, which is why Rorschach steps in. In the film, the cops are a little bit more incompetent, and I know that it's a lot more limited in terms of scope, the film is, and so it sort of has to get them out of the way, and it's a lot easier to portray that, to let the characters step in. In the HBO show, it's a lot more explicit that all cops are bastards and or racist of varying degrees. They don't necessarily all start as such, and their motives are not necessarily all racist and or corrupt, but they are that. And it really examines how, which does tie into the themes of the original novel, how the costuming exacerbates those and amplifies those, and then also how bringing those laws in sort of enable the more fascist tendencies of law enforcement. And you can, it's really interesting that I think Laurie almost comes in and takes a little bit of the Rorschach arc in terms of coming in from the outside and investigating the murder, and she's sort of got that coming in as a character who's not tied into the overall group and becomes a bit of an audience surrogate there, but being outside the main force. So
I'll just quickly, because I think I know where we can go from here, because I know Chaz wants to get into the bulk of it, though it's interesting we ended up no, it's true, like we're just running through the not the grimoire, the dossier. There's a particular,
is it grimoire? I've always thought it's grimoire, but you're probably right. It probably is grimoire.
Yes, I'm pretty sure it's a grimoire, but it's not like the beast yet. Anyway, these are the other, like Hooded Justice, and we see Hooded Justice in two timelines. We see him becoming the origin story of Hooded Justice, which when we eventually talk about it is paralleled to the origin story as it is told in the TV show American Hero Story. Right. So there is the timeline of the story that people think is the story, and then there's the actual story that's presented to us. But that's Will Reeves Hooded Justice, who we also learn is the great grandfather of Angela, Sister Nine. These are two characters that obviously, if you remember back to the image and if you've seen the show, it makes sense. It's, you got Ozymandias and Silk Spectre too, Laurie. Vite is interesting because I think if you've seen the comic, the show, you're like sitting there, keep on cutting back to him and you're like, oh, fuck, it's Vite. It's got to be Vite. Who else is it going to be? Right. And yet I'm sure for people who haven't watched the show, you're like, why do we keep on going back to this guy? Again, coming back to our classic thematic idea, cutting back to him is about the audience asking, why am I being shown this? Right.
I mean, it's fascinating in the show, right? Both Adrian Veidt and Will Reeves essentially only take one important plot action for the entire 9 hours of show. Will Reeves murders Captain Crawford, and Adrian Veidt in the end rains down frozen squid on Lady True. That is pretty much the only two impacts that they have on the plot at all, right? But we spend so much time with both of those characters throughout the runtime of the show. And as you say, if they're not impacting the plot, why are we spending time with them other than for them, for us to be invested in their characters and just enjoy hanging out with, Adrian Veidt farting during a trial that he has created for himself. And Will Reeves, like basically the power of the discussion of race in the HBO show is so dramatized in Will Reeves' backstory.
Well, they're both themes, but we spend time with them in very, very different ways. Like Will Reeves is a lot of flashback and a lot of explicitly tied in through Angela's journey. And with Veidt, it's very much his story operates, and we'll get to this a little bit further, but his story operates almost as this side story. It's this little thing that we take, and there's comedy bits and there's physical bits, and he's giving us some narration about Captain Manhattan. So we've got Wills, who's the inciting incident, Veidt, who we're going, what's happening till the very end. And so that the way that we spend time with them is so different. And I think that they use that really well, commenting on how they impact the story as well.
And how do you think that compares to, I suppose you touched onto it, to Laurie, Silk Spectre coming back as, it's an interesting, like they needed an investigator. And what's interesting is how late she turns up in the show. She turns up in beginning of episode 3. Well, then we learn.
But they are both, so she and Angela are both investigating, but they have different
agendas.
Motives.
And different ties to who they're investigating. Like Angela could not be closer to, like, it's basically her family that she's investigating, both in terms of the cops and in terms of Judd explicitly them having a very sort of close, intimate relationship, whereas Laurie isn't connected to any of them other than knowing a little bit of the history of when the Minutemen start tying in.
Well, I mean, look, Laurie, if we think about her introduction, which you've got here, Stu, here, like Laurie is someone who was the daughter of the first Silk Spectre.
Slide 23.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm not doing that.
She was raised to be a superhero became sent out onto the streets to be a costumed vigilante. They very pointedly in the graphic novel do not call them superheroes. A costume.
She actually calls it herself a superhero. She makes some anyway.
So a costume vigilante at age 16, at which point she falls in love with / is seduced by Dr. Manhattan, a real life superhero, a god among men, a creature who sees time as a flat circle. And at the end of the Watchmen novel, she has gone into hiding, completely. Like, it looks like she's taken on a new identity, changed her hair, like disappearing off the grid, and which she's come back as a government agent hunting down costumed vigilantes.
Which kind of is consistent to what she was saying in the comic, like her worldview, which is going to be a running theme, irony, running aspect of what we're talking about here, right? Like, she is kind of fed up of the whole thing, and she got into it early. She was groomed both by Dr. Manhattan, but also
by her mother.
Sexually by her mother to be a costumed hero. And so this idea that she is kind of like opposed to them is great, right? Like, and it also shows you when we get to given circumstances and we explain what it is. And we're actually we're giving circumstances as part of having to explain it, which is why they're important.
Yeah.
All right. Yep. Sorry. Let's get into the writing bits as soon as possible. Because we keep saying we're going to be touching on it, and then it's like, yeah.
Well, we end up just because we're talking about the characters. Like, I was hoping I was just going to be like real. Like, this is this character, this is character. I love this shot of Laurie with like the pop culture Andy Warhol, which is also something they used in the film. All right. Essentially, the villains, as they're presented in the show, one of them is Lady True, who is the Vite, parallel initially, and then turns out is the daughter of. So essentially, she is serving that role, the world's smartest person, right? And we're not sure of her motivation. And the other character is Joe Keane Jr. And what's interesting about the HBO show is the fact that they've decided to make the politics a little bit more, like the interaction with politicians a bit more important, separately from the Pentagon. Like, the Pentagon are a key part of the movie and the comic, how they manipulate Dr. Manhattan, but less so the actual political machinations. Joe Keane,
although in the comic,
Jr.,
in the comic, we've got fucking Nixon and Kissinger. We repeatedly go back to them as they're struggling to make the decisions. It's just not in the movie. And look, we've already had Julio come on #justice for Snyder. And obviously, Stu, you've already laid out our biases where we don't think the movie is that great an adaptation of the graphic novel. And I've been blocked as a troll for trying to have a civil discussion on Twitter about how I disagree with, like, I don't think it's a
I've known you for a long time, Chaz. Civil discussion isn't exactly what I would say is consistent to your brand.
Did not use any caps. Like, 0 caps. But what I think we're going to get to is, I think, look, Snyder and the writers, we should look them up given this is a screenwriting podcast, but I do truly want to credit them that they fucking rendered a graphic novel that is that fucking thick down into a satisfying
impossible task,
2.5 hour whole narrative. And I think a lot of times we might criticize them for reordering and restructuring things, but I can understand why they've done it just in terms of, we have to get this story told in a certain amount of time.
Yeah, and I disagree with a lot of their aesthetic choices and how they depicted some things. But if you look at the actual bones of it, if you look at the actual structure of it, I think they actually did a fairly good job of trying to condense and trying to make it clear and trying to fit all of these characters. It's a massive ensemble piece, trying to actually fit it into that sort of runtime.
Yeah.
Chaz, we need to keep this focused. It keeps on like tangenting all the freaking time.
That is laying foundation, Stu.
Okay. Speaking of laying foundations, what's important about John Kane, and I only worked this out this morning.
Like 9 a.m. this morning?
It was like 4 a.m. I'm pretty sure is when I got that text.
When I did this, I was like, John Kane. Kane seems a really familiar surname. And the answer is...
Yeah.
It's because of the Keane Act. All right.
The Keane Act. which they do. I actually didn't. So I rewatched the pilot after reading the book, and I didn't twig on it in the pilot initially, but all of the ways that they have in the pilot uses pretty much every possible matter of narration. But in the pilot, when Judd Crawford's driving his truck down the road, the radio is playing, and it actually explicitly says the son of Keene, who passed the Keene Act, etc. It doesn't tell you what the Keene Act is, but says that. So
you're looking at the screen share image now, which is like, this explains it, which is basically the Keene Act outlaws vigilantism, right?
Yep.
It makes
and
costumes.
It was. I mean, we'll get to a point that's in the novel and the movie that we want to discuss. But the whole point of the Keene Act being passed is that cops went on strike to protest vigilantes doing their job for them. And that's why the Keene Act was passed.
Which actually conveniently ties into this little image here. This guy in the GIMP mask. And at some point, we'll talk about the kind of fetish gear in the show. But the GIMP mask is actually the comedian. Right? And we don't see him, I'm pretty sure we don't see him wear the more scary comedian outfit, like evil comedian, like eviler comedian in the movie. But in the comic...
Evilist.
Yeah. In the comic, he definitely has like a less funny, more fetishistic comic costume.
Yeah, and just
I like how he doesn't have a cross though, because the comedian is endorsed.
Yeah, exactly. He's become a fucking CIA agent, as
he's
has Dr.
a plumber. A plumber is the term I think they use. Anyway, that actually kind of. Oh no, there's one more little bit of who the players are, and this is important in terms of us. This is us giving circumstances for our own fucking podcast, right? Which is that there's another player, which is the 7th Cavalry, which if you look at the fucking image and you've watched the show, like it's Rorschach, right? And it's interesting. We had a 2-hour pre-call to set up this thing because there was so much we wanted to talk about, and the three of us, and I don't want to rehash the debate, but we disagreed about whether a Rorschach would approve of the 7th Cavalry or not. For me, what's important is it was a believable extension of the Rorschach of both the movie and the show that someone like the 7th Cavalry would turn up. Not just because he's sending his memoirs at the end of the Watchmen to the New Frontiersmen, like essentially a right-wing conspiratorial group to kind of reveal the truth.
The InfoWars.
What's his name? The Alex. Yeah, absolutely.
Alex Jones. You know, but also the fact that his kind of emphasis on like puritanical living, to me, is connected to my understanding of the kind of quote unquote racial science of white supremacists. Right.
I agree with all that. What I disagree with is I think they're missing the understanding that I think they're taking mostly the right stuff from his writings, but I think that they do not understand the way in which he would happily slaughter most of them for things that he considers to be antithetical to his quote unquote morality.
I'm pretty sure they're willing to slaughter each other for the same thing. So
but there's no doubt that race is almost absent from the book. It is written from a white Englishman's perspective of America.
And
as an American, I can definitely it misses a lot of nuance, both of, and as a queer American, of sexuality as well. But it misses a lot of the racial components that, especially considering that he plays so heavily into New York, that would really be touched on. But
but he has the kid that reads comics. It's heaps diverse.
Yeah, you know.
But it's but the point is that Rorschach is definitely portrayed as a bigot. Like he has pseudo, like as you're saying, Stu, like very puritanical morality code that he holds everyone else against except for himself. And he's got a lot of sexual hangups, which ties a lot into, I guess, the evangelical Christian right movements around the world. I'm not limiting those to America. But
I could write an entire paper just on that.
But because the race is not a big part of it, I can totally understand, Stu, like them taking Rorschach's books, which are loaded with bigotry and hatred, and becoming this right-wing conspiracy
Militia.
or like militia, but you know, more than a militia. The thing that the point that we ended up arguing about is in the actual book and in the movie, Rorschach dies, deliberately gives himself up to be murdered by Dr. Manhattan because something about the conspiracy rubs him the wrong way. It's seen as a compromise that takes away the freedom of people. And that is not in his writings because he's written and finished his journal and mailed it off already by that time, right? The 7th Cavalry don't get to see what Rorschach actually lived and died for. And that's in a way why I also kind of see Looking Glass as a Rorschach
type.
The equivalent of the Rorschach character in the TV series, because he is prepared to live and die by his ideals. Like, whatever Wade Tillman is, he is not a racist. And the racists try and recruit him because I think if we tell you the truth about your trauma, you will, as a white Oklahoma man, which is a joke that gets referenced quite a lot. Like, of course he's a racist. He's a white man from Oklahoma. But they just assume that he is a racist who's been forced not to be a racist.
I just don't think we can ever say that about Rorschach because that's never challenged. It's not part of the pressure that's put on the character. I think it's, and you know, we don't want to spend 20 minutes. I just think it's consistent. It's someone who's like, and we'll get to it. Adrian Veidt could be a possible homosexual, right? Like that for him going, oh, the Hood of Justice could be a black man. Like it's completely consistent. The fact is that we don't know, and there's an interpretation in the adaptation that they've made in the show that extrapolates that. Where when I get to the presentation of Rorschach, given the pace that we're going, probably never will. In the movie, it's a lot more sympathetic to his worldview and doesn't put the audience in a position of laughing at him. Right. Whereas I think, you know, the greatest way to, you know, and I say this as a white guy that lives in Melbourne, the greatest way to kind of like tackle white supremacists is just to laugh at their self-seriousness. But also don't fall into their kind of like Pepe Frog worldview, the whole cold trolling thing. Anyway, I think we should move on to we're
40 minutes in and we're starting the agenda.
Yeah, wow.
We haven't, wait till I get, like, I'm pretty sure so far I've only had like 2 or 3 paragraphs worth of notes on this. Wait till I get to the ones I have pages on.
But hopefully we won't get sidetracked by a certain guy in a flat cap.
So this has turned out great.
And I was going to put like the overly complicated screenwriting diagram, you know, where it's almost like we're trying to sell you a book. We'll like show the diagram and then we're trying to sell you a book to explain the diagram, because that's what you do is you create a problem and then sell the solution. Because what this boils down to, right? This is kind of when we got talking about the what the movie did differently from the book. The main thing that we realized that it was doing differently, that the show somehow had enough sense to understand, was this narrative structure. Narrative structure is a lens that changes how the audience feels relative to character action, character motivation, and character worldview, right? These 3 things can remain the same, but how the audience learns that information and when, influenced by tone, which we've put over here because tone is kind of vague. Not vague, it's kind of ephemeral. That combined with narrative structure influences how we feel about the characters, the world, the worldview, the theme, everything else, right? That if
just to say that what is the same from in the way that the book is the Snyder film is a very faithful adaptation of the book, is that the character actions and the character motivations and the character worldviews are all very, very true to the book. What the main thing that they've changed is the lens that you're talking about, the narrative structure, in terms of what we as the audience learn when, and the tone of how we learn it and how those things are presented. So I think a lot of people feel that it's a very faithful adaptation because the stuff that's inside the box is the same, and all they've changed is the narrative structure and the tone, but that very much changes how we
Tone
feel
is
as an audience.
massive. Yeah, the tone is massive, and how it's depicted, like, you know, you can have two different people present the exact same amount of information. One of them is wildly sarcastic and one of them is completely serious, and that is going to change everything about it. And that is what I think the main issue with the movie is that tone and how that impacts the story.
In a weird kind of way, how we feel, it's not entirely the same thing, but how we feel is almost the theme of the movie as well, or of the piece of art that we're watching.
I think what is interesting is the other thing that changes why some people, without making it sound too analytical, but what makes some people okay with the film and some people like me less okay with it is our personal worldview influence how we feel.
Fascists love the movie.
It's not that the fascists love the movie, right? But if you're sympathetic to
fascists love Fight Club, though, and you can also argue that you know what I mean. Like, there's you can definitely love the movie and not be that, but it exactly what Stu is saying. Like, a lot of you bringing your worldview and projecting that on top of it. However, objectively, you can also argue that there are certain things that pander to X because of tone.
The difference between Fight Club and Watchmen the movie is that Fight Club the movie is a satire and the audience don't get it's a satire. Watchmen the film is not a satire, but the book is. Like, Zack Snyder does not get that it's a satire. He is the
audience that's taken Fight Club seriously. It's like someone who read the book and then didn't realize it was a satire. And this happens. It happens. And that's okay. Like, I'm as someone and I'm developing a satire now, but I've written satires before. Like, satires are difficult because good satires to me run really close to the line. And they are both the thing that they're satire, like Starship Troopers is one of the greatest satires of all time, because it is both the thing it's good at the thing it's criticizing, and it also criticizes it. Like, it's a piece of propaganda that is self-referential, but you can watch it purely as a piece of rah propaganda, right?
Yeah. And like the sex scene in Starship Troopers is, to me, like, this does not need to be here. This is straight out of a B-grade exploitation movie. And then I'm like, oh yeah, it is a B-grade exploitation movie that is satirizing B-grade exploitation movies.
Yeah. All right. So is there anything else on this diagram that we kind of need to run through? Oh, yeah. Okay. The big thing at the top here, right, is this idea of given circumstances, which is where I want to start. And if we end up just talking about this for 30 minutes, then maybe, and people get something out of it, then fine. We can always do Watchmen Part 2. All right. Given circumstances drives character action, character motivation, and character worldview, right? But there are given circumstances that are connected to both the worldview of the audience. We've kind of talked about this in character motivation, which is ultimately there is understandings of the world that we have that is culturally specific, and that will inform how we perceive these. That's why I use the worldview, because worldview isn't necessarily like a political worldview. It's just, this is my understanding of how the world works, and these are the rules of the culture and all that stuff.
I mean, in terms of the Watchmen world, the most powerful example you can use is Vietnam, right? We as an audience come into all forms of the Watchmen knowing fairly well how Vietnam played out, even as just a cultural echo of Vietnam's importance to Western society, right? And the alternative history of it, where Dr. Manhattan, being an American, won Vietnam, changes so much.
And I really like you mentioned the Western society, and I think that particularly as an American, I find it really great that what the show does is it acknowledges the impact of Vietnam on US culture, but it also, much more than most American, even history classes do, acknowledges the impact and the difference that it would have made to Vietnamese culture. And in general, I think a lot of American broadly, both pop culture and just general education, etc., don't acknowledge the massive amount of impact that it had on Vietnam. But right from the beginning, when it places one of our heroes as Vietnamese person, and then later
Vietnamese
one
American.
of the anti-heroes, Vietnamese American because Vietnam became a state, but would have been strictly Vietnamese having been born and raised there had it not become a state with the change. It acknowledges
but a Black
that.
American would never have been born and raised
in Vietnamese.
In
Vietnam.
Exactly, which is it's super fascinating. And then as the further the show goes, the more it delves into actual Vietnamese culture and actually acknowledges how much they were in reality and would have been in this alternate reality impacted by America's actions, which I think is great.
Well, they've taken reality because that's how it is perceived. The American War of Aggression, as they've called it, has a huge influence on Vietnam now. And if those circumstances change, then you have to just take them as reality, which is how I'm going to transition us to given circumstances, right? So there's there's three quotes I'm going to share. Given circumstances is a term that comes from acting, but we actually talked about it in our exposition episode. Someone sent in some feedback. I can't remember his name. Sorry if he's still listening to the podcast. And was like, oh, what you're really talking about is given circumstances. And the challenge of exposition is if the characters have got given circumstances, they don't need to exposit them to the actors because they're who we are, right? So what are given circumstances and why are they useful to screenwriters? All right. So I actually should be starting with Stanislavski, who is the first person that kind of mentioned given circumstances. In the given circumstances, you must be rooted in the play. Do not depart from the play. Don't cut yourself off from your partner in the scene or partners. Kind of vague, but the first part's kind of useful. In given circumstances, you must be rooted in the play, right? For Meisner, who's obviously is an extension of Stanislavski. I mean, he's got his whole Meisner technique, but they're kind of all they're kind of broadly speaking schools of naturalism. Acting is the ability to live truthfully under the given imaginary circumstances. And this is a quote from Viola Davis, who's a writer, not an actor. No, wait, she's an actor.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Like, what?
We're cutting this out of the video. Where did my brain go? No, an actor. Well, first of all, you read the script a million times because of what the script gives you are given circumstances. Given circumstances are all the facts of your character, right? So this is, oh God, that's an awful looking slide. Who did that? Me. Which is Stanislavski, the plot, the facts, the incidents, the period, the time and place of the action, the way of life. These are the given circumstances, and they're
no more beer for you, Stu.
We'll re-record all of this and just have you dub it in. Fix it in post.
Yeah, the given circumstances, just like if, are suppositions, products of the imagination. As in, when you're a actor, you read the script and you infer what year it is, where it is set, all this stuff. It's not like they give you a list of facts at the beginning of the script. You're meant to go through and highlight them and construct them. But ultimately, the idea is these are the given circumstances are what are facts in your world, both your personal world and the world at large, that drive your character motivation. So one of the biggest given circumstances in Watchmen, the show, is the squid, right? In the Watchmen comic, the grand conspiracy that Rorschach was trying to uncover, which came to bear, was that Ozymandias, Veidt, basically staged a very elaborate false flag attack on New York City, where he teleported in a gigantic squid that killed millions in order to unite the world against a foe that they effectively could never beat because it was a trans-dimensional being, right?
Not unlike, say, a virus.
Yeah, exactly, right? Though this is contained. And this is a grand fact of the show, right? And they do a very good job of, early on in the pilot, having Angela and her daughter driving along, and there is a squid fall, as we learn as the terminology.
So
right?
it's her son, Topher.
Yep.
Can I, so real quick, can we go in order real quick? Because I've got the 7 big things that the pilot sets up, and the squidfall is actually the 3rd, but it specifically comes off the back of 2 other things with Angela and Topher.
Yeah, okay. I think we just quickly, I'll get to your slide. I want to skip past. We can talk about why that's so good. In the slide, actually, okay. I just want to quickly say what's so good about the squidfall is it shows the impact of the world on the characters. And one of the good thing about given circumstances is that it's about characters. So if you've got aspects of your world you need to set up, you need to show that are different from the audience's everyday world, you need to show how it impacts the character. But because it's part of their facts of their world, you need to make them treat it as if it is the new normal, right? We are living in isolation. This is the new normal for us. It is the given circumstances of our world. For us, the explanation that we need to keep socially distanced and stuff is not something we need to necessarily explain to each other, right? So if you're trying to tell a story of this time, you need to find a way to dramatize that we're all standing like 2 arms lengths away and we're not seeing each other. But we're not going to sit there and exposit to each other, right?
It's not more like what? Yeah, like I hate when I watch TV shows and it's like, "Hello, brother." You know, you don't say that to your brother.
You know they're your brother.
You know they're your brother, and there's so much. Yeah, and it's managing to exposit those given circumstances while making it feel natural. The siren goes off. She pulls over. The squid fall. She wipes them off the car. This is just
so
a
matter of fact.
Mundane.
Yes, it's brilliant.
It's literally a matter of fact.
But then
this is the contrast. I just want to say this is the contrast to the movie, which did not have the squid fall. They have effectively, a lot of their plot changes are about making it that the conspiracy is to look like Dr. Manhattan is the enemy of the world, that they're making the world unite against Dr. Manhattan, right? And I'm not going to go into their explanation for why they did that, but the show is very clearly setting up its given circumstances in the pilot is that it's the sequel to the comic, not to the movie. That's your list. Do you want it on screen or do you want me to turn it off and you can kind of like 1, 2, 3?
Yeah, no, you can leave them up, but I have ordered them in my own notes in terms of.
Oh no, I'll turn it off and then.
I think let's
leave it up there.
I mean, look, that was my very quick. I only had 5 minutes working on the keynote as opposed to the hours that Stu and Mel, and hence why my slide was so ugly. But I thought in terms of the given circumstances that Damon Lindelof had as a challenge. Is I'm going to have people coming into watching my show who know the Watchmen, and I'm going to have people coming into my show who don't know the Watchmen, and I'm going to have to give different levels of information to both of those audience members. And it's the same if you're writing any script. Like, you don't have to tell people why they're speaking in English, why they're dressed in a certain way, why there's buildings and cars and blah, blah, blah. There's given circumstances that people are prepared to accept. You have to tell them what's different. And so what Lindelof has had to do is say, here are the things that I'm porting out of the book into the show, and there's also new things that have happened that I have to tell you about. And I feel like if I say that these are the things, then Mel, you can tell us the order that they've done them in the pilot and how amazingly they've dramatized them. So from the book, we've got that vigilantes have been outlawed, but that the cops are now essentially vigilantes because they're allowed to wear masks, right? So there's that idea of authority versus like identity that has come holus bolus from the book. The outcome of the Vietnam War has been holus bolus brought straight in and is super important to the show. Dr. Manhattan as a god is an idea that even because Dr. Manhattan as a character in the show is only in the later episodes, like the last 3 episodes, but they've had to tell new audience members that in this world, there is a single person who is a godlike figure.
Like Palpatine.
Yeah. And then there's the squids, which we're about to talk about. And then which certain characters, I mean, I say carefully selected. I just feel sorry for Night Owl, who Dan Dreiberg just did not make it to the HBO show. And then on top of that, what has happened since 1985 to the present day in the HBO show that is in the past to these characters. So they're not going to fucking sit around and talk about it, but they have to dramatize it for their audience, is the idea that the Tulsa City Massacre is true in both timelines. And as a result, the Tulsa City Massacre has provided President Robert Redford with the opportunity to pass a reparations bill. Now, it's only in relation to the Tulsa City Massacre, not all slavery. And that I find that as a fascinating idea because it concentrates this whole race war conflict around Oklahoma, which is just amazing, and has led to the contemporary expansion of that battle as being the police's seeming #1 job in this world seems to be policing racism, to the point like there's a whole sequence where they go into a like quote unquote like
racial violence. I'll be much more explicit. I don't think they're policing racism.
Yep, I think that's a very good insight. But what I love is that sequence where they go into the trailer park and start like rounding up known violent racists, and it's showing the police being these oppressive right-wing fascist police force enforcing a very quote unquote progressive ideal of we're rounding up racists. All right, so those are the given circumstances that the show has had to deal with. Mel, take it away as to how the pilot amazingly dramatizes these things.
Well, okay, first, real quick, let's touch on Night Owl, because the pilot, he's not in the show at all, but the pilot explicitly calls him out in 4 ways. So, first is there's a visual nod to Night Owl when we meet Angela, which I'm going to get to when I talk about how the show is written visuals. There's a really clear owl visual. Then, a little bit later, when we get into Judd Crawford's area, Night Owl's book is on his desk, so clearly he's been reading his book. And then immediately after that, we see Angela drinking from an owl mug, which is probably my favorite Easter egg for the whole thing. And then at the end of the episode, it's his ship that's actually being used on the raid in the Night Supremacist, or at least a ship based off of the build-in model of his ship. So all of these things add up to nodding to Night Owl, even though we don't meet him. So which I love that we do that. So here's the order that the pilot presents all of these given circumstances that you've touched on in. First, we hear about reparations. We hear it called the Redfordation Act, which because of the way that we hear it called that, right? And initially we don't know what it means. However, just this bully kid saying the word sets Topher off. So we realize that word is clearly slang or something that is supposed to be acrimonious.
Yeah.
So it sets him off.
It's certainly controversial.
Because he gets into a fight about it immediately. And then we see him in the car and he's saying, well, you wanted to punch him for saying that. It's racist to call it that, which is really clever on 3 levels. First of all, the President Redford level, which they will tie in later, which they will confirm later that it is now President Redford. Second, it's so close to reparations that because of our modern context, and if you know about the argument around reparations in the US, you can kind of infer it. And third, it allows, because it is a child-adult conversation, it does allow for a little bit more exposition. So it's introduced in this concept and then explained in the next scene. So introduced, explained, and then I believe it's the next episode where Angela goes to the museum to test her grandfather's DNA. You get this exposition from, museum placards, which are essentially like 3D people. And that's a perfectly natural thing. Museums do explain things. So it's really clever. I love the fact that this show uses literally every expositional technique. In the pilot alone, you've got the radio on in the car, you've got a newspaper visuals, you get exposition to a classroom, you have an interview, you have events like that are basically a press conference. It has characters talking to each other, explaining things, and then when Lori comes in, she's used to explain things. Like, it uses every possible technique, but it doesn't overuse any of them. If everything were given to us via radio exposition, that would be boring. So after the reparations, Angela's show and tell is one big narrative dump, but it's excusable because she's talking to a class of children. So we learn Vietnam's a state. We learn about President Redford, which again is confirmed later on at the dinner table. We learn what White Knight was. We learn that cops wear masks now, and we get a bit of Angela's personal history as well, where she talks about having been a cop, where she talks about having retired from the force.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
It's so from my memory of the pilot, because you've rewatched it more recently than I have, that it opens on the Tulsa City massacre, but then the first present day scene is that cop pulling over the guy who ends up being in the Rorschach. So that as a piece of dramatization does so much. It says the cops wear masks in this world, but it's illegal for non-cops to wear masks.
I don't, it's explicit about the Rorschach mask. It doesn't say that it's illegal for people to wear masks, but it explicitly makes it seem like he's a Ku Klux Klan member. So,
but he says there's a guy who has a mask.
Confirmed by Angela. He does specify it's a Rorschach mask.
Yeah, I'm just saying, in that scene, a guy is basically permitted to have use lethal force because he's seen someone have a mask in his glove box. Right? It's just, a
guy wearing a mask is allowed to use lethal force because he sees someone else with a mask. It's really great.
In terms of, and the only reason why I harp on about it is What I'm talking about is in terms of all of us as writers, we come into our story and there's a whole lot of given circumstances that the audiences don't know that we have to give to them. And look, we could have just done a whole live stream just about exposition in the pilot and how it does exposition perfectly. But I actually think, given the different things that we have, it's going to be more interesting to talk about exposition as well as theme and tone and characters and all those kind of things. But I just wanted to make the point that it does so well about dramatizing it, because that whole sequence about the cop and the 7th Cavalry is not really that important to the show as an overall thing. It is just a cold open that is giving us so much information about the world. And then it goes into what you're talking about, the school kids show. Yes,
I think it does it intentionally, because if you haven't gotten all the nuance of it, it's going to get explained 2 scenes later, essentially. Because it is really great, that scene. It's very intense on how it delivers that. But then you're kind of going, what salad? What black guy? What? Why is it yellow? Yeah, I think if there's some detail that you might be confused about in that scene, that then gets explained in the next thing, but it doesn't open by explaining it and then show. It shows and then tells you about the little nuances.
Yeah.
Immediately after that, we get the squid fall, which we've already talked about, which is a really great. It's so matter of fact.
Does the Looking Glass, the point where he talks about the squids, like in sadness, is that in the pilot as well, where he's talking about these poor creatures are like they fall out of the sky and they don't know why they've been shifted, in dimensions, and they spend their last minutes suffocating and dying on this world. Like, I'm totally paraphrasing from memory.
Yeah, it's not in the pilot. It might be later. The only real thing we get from Looking Glass here is the exposition of how the cop world works, which is great. But the squid fall is sort of the only thing we see about the squid, and Callan, one of his daughters, hosing them off immediately afterwards, again, which is very matter of fact.
Yeah,
is all we get about them in the pilot.
Yeah.
Which is there more on your list?
Yeah, just real quick.
Yeah, I'll let you go through it.
There's the newspaper that Will is reading when we meet him, saying Veidt is dead. So it's a nod to the graphic novel and also a continuation of using multiple techniques to deliver information. Then we get Captain Judd's speech to the cops, which gives us some parameters around the new laws. It's drawing into, we clearly, like you said, the second scene is this thing about masks, but when his speech to the cops, and then Panda's like pulling out the rule book and saying, this is the rule, which is in fitting with his character, which we've already met in just by hearing his voice when the cop calls in. We realize that his character is incredibly pedantic, incredibly rule driven. So when he pulls out this rule book and reads the rule, it fits with what we already know about his character.
Yeah.
So Captain Judd's speech gives us starts drawing in some of the finer details around the parameters of this law. And then we hear about the Keene Act. There's a simple explanation, and it doesn't really need to be exposited as much as things like a squid fall, because the legalities of how an act like that work do fit within our modern societal understanding of broad legal frameworks.
Yeah.
So unlike a squid fall, which is completely outside of our normal, they really don't need to explain the Keene Act. They just need to say, this is a Keene Act, it outlaws this, moving on. And then actually the last thing is not in the pilot, but it talks, I think it's really crucial since we're talking about world building and given circumstance. The other biggest thing of given circumstance, which isn't till next episode, is Ozymandias's play about Dr. Manhattan's birth. Because Dr. Manhattan is one of the few superheroes who has actual supernatural powers. So giving us some understanding of his creation and his power is really important in how we understand with this world and how we understand with how the characters interact with him in this world.
All right. Is that the list?
I'm done. That's the list.
All right. I think what's important is the given circumstances drive character action, character motivation, and character worldview, right? As we learn about Looking Glass, he was at more or less ground zero of the squid attack, right? So we see him act over. Oh wait, I should share the screen because I'm pointing at my PowerPoint and So the given circumstances drive character action, they drive the character's worldview, and they drive character's motivation. But the way they're presented, the audience changes how we feel about the character. So in the case of Looking Glass, he, as we learn, was more or less at Ground Zero. He was in New York during the squid attack. That has influenced how he's acted. It's why he puts on the mask. It's why he behaves certain ways to the squid. But we learn that given circumstance of that character later on, right? Damn it. I've lost my mouse. Okay, cool. So that changes our understanding of the motivation. In making it a reveal to us, it changes how we feel about the character. If we knew at the beginning that he was there at the initial squid attack, then we're going to have a perception of the character. That they've made a choice to make it a reveal because it changes how we feel about the character. But there's other times that we need to state this stuff up front, like the 51st State or the existence of the Kane Act, etc., in order to make sure that it's not that we're aligned, but that we're feeling a particular way the whole way. Does that make sense? That's why given circumstances, as much as that we reveal what characters have done, what motivates them, and what makes them, what they say, what they do, and then what motivates them to do those things are kind of constants relative to our experience of them. That given circumstances is something that we also learn through narrative structure. That makes sense? Right, but like the fact that Judd is a member of the 7th Cavalry is actually given circumstances for that character, right? It's
for
not,
that character, which is why a rewatch is super interesting, not necessarily from a writing level, but from an acting level, because obviously when you're writing it, the actor sees the whole picture, so the actor knows. You don't need to write that in the action line. So it's going to come through his performance, going back and rereading that sort of thing. So it is a given circumstance, but you have to have essentially read the entire thing to know that it's a given circumstance as an audience member, whereas for a character, it's a given circumstance from the beginning, and the actor's clearly playing it that way.
Which is why it's good for, this is why given circumstances are important for characters, and what those quotes are saying is read the whole thing, understand where you're coming from, and play true to that.
Yep.
And as a writer, you need to do the same thing. You need to play truth to the character, and that's why the mustache twirling villain thing is always so frustrating, because it's the character playing both the truth of it, but they're flagging it to the audience, as opposed to it being a more subtle aspect of how they perform.
So guys, we're an hour and 15 in. What are we going to do for the next half an hour?
Well, I think the next slide is story depiction, story mechanics, and depiction of time, but there's Rorschach in particular to that first. So the depiction of time in the narrative is more what I have some stuff on, but I think Stu had a lot around the Rorschach.
And I think the Rorschach stuff is really good.
Yeah.
Okay.
How structure affects audience experience, which is what we've already touched on. So go for it.
All right. Okay. So I don't need the full time. And look, we can always do a sequel to this.
I'm not sure there's an audience for that, but sure.
Speak for yourself, Chaz. I will do a 1 hour, one-man show tomorrow. This time tomorrow. Just say in the live chat if you want, it could just be Stu and Mel tomorrow, just continuing on Watchmen. Vote with thumbs up. Oh, wow. Why did it start it started from the beginning? Wow.
I could take all of my notes and turn this into a very long blog post that only 4 people will read. That's always an option.
So I want to keep on interrupting. And as my shirt says, I get interrupted by morons all the time. If you just let me just ran through the cast of characters, we would have done that in 2 minutes. All right.
Chris, please go back and re-edit just the amount of time that he was talking about that cast of characters and see if that was really 2 minutes.
Me, not other people.
Yeah,
She
yeah,
keeps
exactly.
blaming me. I think I took us on one 3-minute
No,
tangent.
every time I brought up a character, you're like, oh, by the way, guys, you really need to know what I think. This is what I
an
think.
old couple arguing and me coming in. I think I need to start playing first AD a little bit more. All right, Stu, go.
Okay, so the biggest difference I think between the show, so we've the movie and the comic. So we're gonna step back from the show. We're gonna look at the comic versus the movie. Is their presentation of Rorschach, and I think the key aspect, and there's not a quote for this, but Zack Snyder basically said he saw Rorschach as the most important character in the comic, and I think they've made choices consciously or subconsciously, but they're still choices in how they present Rorschach to the audience to make him more sympathetic in the film, that to align our experience closer to Rorschach so we understand where he's coming from, which means that even if we learn the same facts about him, the same given circumstances of the kind of person who he is, that it's actually harder. It becomes more, our opinion of the character is more ossified. It makes it harder for us to go, oh, they're a bad person, right? So one of the key things, and I've been watching the Ultimate Cut when I was compiling this, because I was like, okay, they might have cut stuff from time, but the Ultimate Cut's meant to represent the directorial vision. What have they done? There's an early scene in the comic, page 16, issue 1, right? So we open Rorschach investigating the crime, him going to the night owl. Actually, I think the scene might have been before Night Owl. It's actually kind of irrelevant. It's really early on. Basically, Rorschach turns up at a bar, and I love this little panel here, right? Because he's trying to suss out who killed, just basically shake down some dudes. No, God, no. Don't kill anybody, right? Please don't kill anybody. Like they know who he is, and they're saying, don't kill anyone. And then the next page, he starts breaking pinkies for information, right? Look at that panel down here, right? This is cut from the film entirely.
Oh, not entirely.
Okay. They've put it much later. They've done a version of that film, so it's like, oh, we're getting the fan moment, but putting this scene so early is to make you go, Rorschach, like, kind of willing to torture people to get told information, even if they're very clear, like, we don't actually know. And he continues with the violence. There's a kind of a sadistic streak to Rorschach that is as less prevalent in the movie. What they seem to have replaced it with in the film is him attacking the cops. And I'm not going to play it, but he attacks a cop when they come in. But that's slightly different because it's them coming him in the middle of an investigation. So the audience is going to be aligned with him. And therefore, he attacks the cops in order to get away with his investigation. And as they explicitly invented dialogue to explain, oh, he's not even hospitalized. They actually get him to violently attack just these 2 uniformed police officers. And then he's like, doesn't really count. They didn't have to go to hospital, right? So it keeps us on side. But this admission of this early is to make sure that we're on the side of Rorschach, right?
Whereas, so what, like, just to belabor your point, Alan Moore does not want us to like Rorschach. Alan Moore wants us to think that Rorschach is a horrible, smelly psychopath. Like in the book, they reinforce that he stinks, that he does not wash.
I do think that he wants us to very initially go, oh yeah, this guy has a point, before realizing how horrific that point is when actually taken to its ultimate end. But other than that, completely agree.
The next kind of scene I want to point out, it's a very subtle change to do with dialogue, and it's the kind of thing that you're cutting it for, that you can sit there and say, oh, they're cutting it to make it shorter. It's literally 3 syllables. So it's the scene where Rorschach comes in to visit Night Owl. In the comic, he's kind of eating the beans, which is something also that they kind of have a nice echo of Looking Glass, eating beans in the mask, exactly like this frame, right? A nice little Easter egg. And he comes in and he throws down the comedian's badge and was like, I found it. Sorry. That's the wrong slide. That was a Mel slide that I think I moved around. And so this is how the scene plays in the movie. Hang on. I should be able to.
Looking at that color palette is 100% the movie.
Yeah. And I could talk about the color palette relative. I'm going to go. The one thing about the color palette in terms of tone, if we're talking about tone, and this scene's about tone, is that the limited color palette of this being a comic, Zack Snyder is interpreted as desaturation, right? That is not going to have the same emotional effect. This is not a desaturated color palette. It's a restricted color palette. There is a difference. And that black and white tends to have as I talk about to my students, because I teach motion design, connects us to humans essentially see black and white at night. Our night vision is more tuned to black and white. So my thinking about black and white movies is we perceive them as more serious because it actually puts us in the fight mode. It puts us in, we're at night, we don't know what's around the corner, right? The comic, as much as it's got this dirty palette, it's saturated, it's clear colors. The movie has made a deliberate choice to make it look more like a fucking serial killer movie. It is saying this shit, it should be more serious. Compare that to Starship Troopers, which has also got a restricted color palette, but it's lit like a soapy. It's meant to make you have additional motion reaction. Same way that what's a good the Matt Vaughn
Kick-Ass.
Kill and like Echo from Kick-Ass also has like a brighter color palette just to make you appreciate it more as satisfying. Yeah. So this is the scene with the it's like 30 seconds.
Is this bean juice?
Human bean juice. Badge belonged to the comedian. Blood too. He's dead.
That's the facts, right? It's the comedian's thing. In the comic, what happened to the panel? Oh, okay, cool, great. The panel's not there. Essentially, the panel, which is meant to have been there, and it's got magically moved. Oh, here it is. Human bean juice, blogged. Okay. Sorry. Blood belonged to the... That's human bean juice. Oh, man. Good old PowerPoint. That's right, human bean juice. Ha, ha. Blood belonged to the comedian. He's trying to make himself laugh, but it's not funny. It's kind of a bad taste joke. And I think it's meant to make us feel that Rorschach doesn't know how to connect with people. It's meant to make us feel something about Rorschach in that moment. They've made the decision to cut the ha because it doesn't align with what they want us to feel about Rorschach at that moment. To me, that's human. That's right, human bean juice. It's like, oh, you're kind of a dick, right? That's what we're meant to feel like it, and they've taken it out because it makes us go, Rorschach, kind of a dick. Right? Related to this, and this is just very, very subtle changes in dialogue, but that change how we feel about the character, right? So there's the larger structural thing, which I was pointing out, but all these very subtle things. This is structural as well, right? So basically, Rorschach in the comic goes to visit Veidt Ozymandias and makes a joke about his merchandising, which is something they cut from the film, which is a shame because it's actually a great piece of satire that it ends the Veidt discussion with a close-up on all Veidt's toys of himself. And it starts with him saying, meeting with Veidt left bad taste in mouth, pompous and decadent, betraying even his shallow liberal affectations, possibly homosexual, must remember to investigate further, right? And then he starts talking about Night Owl and all the other members of the Minutemen and what happened to them, right? And then...
But that line, possibly homosexual, must remember to investigate further, even as it's drawn, it's in a different... scrap of paper from torn out of the diary, and it's to make us laugh at Rorschach. Like anyone who has a shallow liberal affection, I should investigate for being a homosexual.
Yeah, right. And also deliberately that parallel. Look at the parallel visuals between possibly, and then, well, so a few of us left active, healthy, and without mental, without personality disorders. We're meant to be laughing at Rorschach at this point, going, God, you're someone who just takes themselves way too seriously. So how do they do this in the movie? They take Rorschach
way too seriously.
Way too seriously. So they've made two choices here. So this is the scene, and I've edited it for brevity because he basically gives the backstory to all these characters for like a minute, right?
Why are so few of us left active, healthy, and without personality disorders? Even Adrian Veidt, possible homosexual, must investigate further.
I just don't think the film version of it has the same landing because it's not drawing the parallel. One, it's not drawing the equivalent of the visual parallel between the his homosexual and possible mental disorders, like this unaware hypocrisy. But also they've dropped the question mark, possibly homosexual, remember, like this kind of like Mimo to self joke makes us laugh at Vite. This structure disconnects this idea of shallow liberal affectations with this idea that he must be gay, right? The live fact, like this is a piss take of kind of like even in when the comic was put in, this idea that left-wing men are snowflakes, that they're kind of effeminate, etc. The soy boys, that equivalent is taken out. They're actually making him take it seriously, and they want us to take it seriously that Vite is possibly gay. And that is a problem, right? Because the whole thing is a list of the reason that Silhouette is kicked out because of her own deviant lifestyle. You know, everyone is a victim of their mental disorders except Vite. Except Rorschach. The reason that Rorschach is allowed to continue being Rorschach is because he is mentally healthy.
And if you look at the parallels, you know, how Tim Blake Nelson's Looking Glass is sort of the modern equivalent, and how they treat him. They treat his actions seriously. Yes, his actions have important impact, and they treat his trauma seriously, but they act as though some of the things that he believes, you know, in terms are actually more absurdist. And it's not a one-to-one parallel like it is with the movie and the comics, but I do think that there's definitely that aspect in the way that they treat Looking Glass is much better in terms of recognizing his hypocrisy and recognizing some of the absurdity of some of the things that he says, especially through Laurie, especially in the way that Laurie treats Looking Glass.
But it's not just
meant to be the audience surrogate in terms of like, yeah, actually, dude, you're being fucking ridiculous and not taking it so seriously as the movie does.
Well, it's not just Looking Glass. If you look at the Tulsa City Police Department, you've got Red Scare and the pirate lady and the panda bear. Like, they are paying out deliberately these, you know,
panda much.
And I mean, I don't know if we've got a shot of it. I don't think we do. And I tried to look for one and I couldn't get there for some reason. But the police department, you've mentioned already, the Captain Judd giving that, Captain Crawford giving that speech at the beginning, like early on, as to how they're going to react to this upsurge in potential racist violence or the shooting of the cop. It looks like something out of Hitler's Germany, right?
Or 1984. Yeah, for sure.
It's got all the like
straight out of 1984.
Yeah, straight lines, gothic, concrete, like all those brutalist visual imagery with a fucking panda bear sitting in there. Like they understand that what they are, and they're telling us as the audience that this is a satire. And the fact that Laurie comes in and laughs at those characters later on and their choice of, like, what does she call Looking Glass? Like, she has
Mirror
a whole
Man. And
yeah.
I think she has a couple. She's like Jack from Lost, like not Sawyer. She has a couple of different things that she throws at him.
Yeah, but also she laughs at the pirate guy and Red Scare and yeah.
Well, putting Red Scare in that spandex is exactly something that a spoof movie would do, which is great. I think the way that they do present some of the characters as costumes, particularly the extras, just the sort of the subsidiary characters, is quite interesting. Also, and I know we're not going to really delve into it, but just giving Sister Night her rosary anal beads, like, it's clearly meant to be a bit of a like nudge nudge, you know, wink wink, this is a sexual / absurdist / there's a lot going on here sort of note.
So just broadly, the show knows it's a satire in terms of its treatment of superheroes and costume vigilantes in a way that the film does not portray them in that way. And this, talking about gimp masks and sexuality, Stu, can we go to the...
Oh, that's actually what's queued up right now.
Okay, fantastic.
I was trying to find a tangent because I spent a lot of time and I just kind of want to go through. I went a whole bunch of comic versus movie comparisons, right? Because I think there's two things to talk about, right? I'm gonna share the screen. Right. So this is related to tone and theme in the comic versus the movie, right?
Yep.
And hopefully we can then talk about what the film did, right? So this is the scene with the comedian and the night owl. This is starts off with the funeral for the comedian and everyone reflecting on their little moments with him. So that's where we start up. Let me annotate and I can probably draw a up here, it's essentially like a series of flashbacks of everyone watching the comedian's coffin getting buried. And let's not talk about how the movie made the burial of the comedian like so drawn out in a way that the comic, by nature of the sequential art, both decompresses it but makes it the same pace. Yeah. Right. So essentially, it's this moment where the Night Owl recalls a moment with the comedian, which is what we see here. This moment when there's these protesters.
Yeah.
Right. I'm going to talk about what I've observed, and then you should talk about what you observed. And it goes from his flinking to this wide shot of the owl ship just being there, and then essentially the comedian, the Night Owl, firing tear gas into the crowd, and the comedian then choosing to shoot some of them, right? Mm-hmm. So down here, he kind of shoots them, but they've largely dispersed because of the tear gas. And look at that mask, right? That's what you wanted to talk about. Like the GIMP mask is that and that and that, right? He looks fucking scary, right? Yeah. We know it's the comedian because of the kind of like shoulder pads, but also like who else are they fucking talking about? So how have they chosen to present this in the movie?
Well, can I just say, before you jump into the movie, this was the moment where I at Christmas time, I'd read the book and watched the movie. And without analyzing this particular scene, I brought it to your guys' attention because I'm like, this movie lionizes the comedian, whereas Alan Moore treats the comedian as the problem. And that to me is the whole thematic problem that Zack Snyder misses with the movie. And I had forgotten the mask, right? You're about to show the scene, and this scene paints the comedian as a hero, whereas the comic book this is a deranged man doing terrible things.
All right. So this is the side-by-side between the comic and the scene from the film. Actually, I might turn it down because otherwise we might get blocked.
What's the might in that, Stu?
Well, I don't think the visuals, I think with this stuff, the visuals are different enough. All right. So when they dwell on it, what I want to point out is the film spends a long time establishing the protesters as a threat. The comic, the protesters are not the threat. The threat with this framing over here is Night Owl and the fucking comedian. The film, look at the length of this tracking shot. It's like the protesters are a problem. And then there's the Kuro arrival, the cavalry coming in, right?
And it's interesting how that looming over in one is lionizing and in the other it's threatening, because you can use it both ways.
Yeah. Because in the book, this moment is supposed to be portraying like Night Owl's kind of mourning of the costume vigilantes having to turn themselves against the people that they were aspiring to protect, right? It's supposed to be, this was when it all went wrong. And that is not what the movie is doing at all.
And I don't even think they're conscious of necessarily the problem with starting with an establishing shot like that. But if you understand narrative point of view and what we're doing, we're not with the characters, the crowd, we're not inside their experience. What we are doing is witnessing their violence. And also this choice right here, the fire thrown on Night Owl is again showing the protesters as a threat. And this wide shot here again shows the protesters as a threat. And this is nothing that they're doing in the comic. In the comic, they're deliberately trying to be showing that it is fucking Gimp Man comedian and the Night Owl.
And he gets a can thrown at him.
Yeah. Okay. That does it. That's the joke. It's a fucking can. Right. That's the joke. It's a can that gets thrown at him, not a fucking firebomb. It's like, okay, guys, you've asked for this.
Yeah.
It's a freaking tin can. Like,
it's an excuse for the violence.
It's an excuse
for
the
comedian.
violence. They've made a choice to justify. So we understand the character motivation and the worldview. They are, and this is what the movie has gotten wrong.
Well, and Snyder has deliberately decided not to go with the GIMP mask for the comedian in this sequence.
Yeah, that's an absolute conscious choice, given how slavish some of these frames are. Right. But then this moment right here, this is the one that you pointed out, because they've even got the line here that they go on, he's interacting with the crowd, and then she says,
"My son's a police officer, you fucking faggots!"
Right. It's got the line verbatim, and he gets hit with the tin can. And then there's this moment here, so Snyder, but it's like, it's not in the fucking comic, right? This hero's landing is not in the fucking comic. because it makes him look like a fucking legend as opposed to he's a guy that is beating up American citizens. And then he goes into their speech, right? Which is a very textually consistent speech, but the speech about the comedian saying, I am the American dream, this is what happened to it.
Yeah.
And all of this circles back to tone, right? Because we were talking about how tone is what matters so much, whereas the writing of that scene actually works, but the way that it is written doesn't. Like it pragmatically gets across all of the things that it needs to do to accomplish what it's doing, but it's the way that it's written and then shot, which is a problem.
In defense of the Zack Snyder film, it's not that it doesn't work. It's that it's saying something very fucking
right. Absolutely.
Right?
Very
like
fucking
Stephanie
different.
Parsons in the chat earlier said that the Snyder cut Snyder film, because of its shorter length, had less time to spend on like the world and politics and for current issues. And I'm like, yeah, but the 2009 is playing out America post 9/11 and the role of like violence and hawkishness and fascism, and
we're the world's police, essentially. I say we as the American royal we.
And it's doing that visually as opposed and in music, like the music that they've got in the background of that scene, you know, like he's making so many choices that Alan Moore would just be spinning in his grave over. Not to say that that's right or wrong, right?
Or that he's in a grave.
Yeah.
Okay, so this brings us to violence.
He is a black magician. I'm sure he's got a grave somewhere.
Okay, so a cult magician.
No, he's a magician. Like, not a magician, a sorcerer. Like he practices black magic.
Yeah, but they don't call themselves magician. Jeez, what a way to understand, right? Okay, this brings us to vulnerability and violence, which is something that I think is that the show sits somewhere between the film, but it lets us talk about two scenes. I want to talk about the opening attack on the comedian, and then we can talk about the silk owl, night owl, and the silk spectre in the alleyway, right? So I think the biggest difference that they've made in the choice between the movie adaptation and the comic is the vulnerability of the superheroes. Night Owl in the comic is, I mean, I was gonna like, that's their presentation of fat. Like he just looks like me, right down to the goggles. But they're definitely playing up as being like an impotent, overweight, middle-aged man. And in the movie, he very quickly, as much as they're kind of like putting in the geeky glasses and stuff, it's basically like he takes the glasses off and it's like that moment from like a, and teen movie where it's like, oh my God, they're so hot. Right, like they've gone that, but it's particularly also the way they treat bodies. That the bodies in the comic are vulnerable. That it's very clear that the superheroes are not, that the costume vigilantes are just vigilantes. They're not super abilities. They're very well trained, and this kind of is very clear right from the opening. So this is the opening few pages of the Watchmen. What's really cool, and Mel hopefully will get the opportunity to talk about parallel timelines. One of the things that the comic does is uses color palettes to do intercutting. So essentially the red is the flashbacks, the kind of red tinted panels, the flashbacks to the comedian's death. And then the green tinted palettes are the ones that are the present day of the police officers investigating, right? But there's very little of the fight, right? They're just like flash frames of them trying to piece together the fight from the evidence. The movie has made a decision to present us the fight as the opening scene, right? So it's not a flashback, so we're not getting moments pieced together from the evidence, but it's also the presentation of what happens to the comedian that's important. And what I want to say quite off the bat is that the violence against the comedian is he is basically given a level of super ability that is implausible, right? And is inconsistent with the comic.
Well,
this is cut. This is me just cutting the extreme moments. It's like it's a 2-minute fight. Like they've literally taken that compressed thing and make it a whole big fight sequence. They've kind of already heroed it out. But then there's these moments of like, oh God, you'll see it like, okay, slow motion here, kicks open the door, but then he's like getting the shit beaten out of him. Like that's fuck. As someone who actually does like martial arts, that's a serious beating. It will fuck you up. And then this punches like shit off wall. Who has ever punched their hand through a fucking wall and not broken every bone? gets thrown into like a fucking glass. Look at this. He catches a meat cleaver. This is like superpowers. This is not in the comic at all. These guys have superpowers. Like that is just insane.
Let's just acknowledge that the assailant, not the comedian, but the assailant is Ozymandias, who both in the comic and in the TV show catches a flying bullet.
Oh, okay.
It does.
That's true.
When he catches it in the thing, I don't remember if he's wearing gloves or not, but I definitely do remember it tears his hands up. But you are correct.
Yeah, that is correct. But it's not something that they've chosen to present in the comic this early, right?
Yeah.
It's clearly saying that these people have abilities beyond normal human abilities, right? And I'm comparing it because this is stuff that they've invented. And like, okay, cool. He's like, they've broken off a marble bench top. Like, fuck. Why is his head not caved in? Why is he still alive here? Because they're making the violence. It's an opportunity for the violence to be more gratuitous in the sense that it's more stylized, right? And this is cool little, like they've done like some nice little moments like this. When he's falling is a reference to the comics kind of 3 panels down the side, right? Where it's him falling and we're enjoying it. Like it's got these moments where they've captured the visual of the frames. It's what they've invented in between that betrays a misunderstanding.
And look, part of this is they had to do something live action, right? They had to fill in the panels somehow. And it's the choices they've made as to how to fill in those panels.
But they could have done it with the detectives, flashing back to, this is the evidence, flashback to that moment.
Absolutely.
Evidence, flashback to that moment.
Yeah. They wanted to spend less time with the detective. So that's where I'm kind of like on their side from a narrative perspective. But the Contrarians did a review of Watchmen, and I loved their assessment of it. Like you guys can go and listen to their podcast on it. But a lot of the choices, I feel like we've already gone into tone and how Snyder is portraying the characters and how that is just in how it's portrayed, and then the order in which they're portraying the exact same actions from the book. You can understand why people are saying, well, this is the most faithful adaptation ever made. But to me, if it's portraying those things in a different order or in a different way that sends a different message, that tells the audience to feel differently about those characters, then how can you call that a faithful adaptation? Anyway, in the Contrarians, they did mention an interview with Zack Snyder where he was allegedly trying to be satirical. At the 2009 time, the superhero movies were not horrendously violent. We didn't have Kick-Ass. We didn't have Deadpool, right? And so he was saying, I'm going to portray super graphic violence to make people feel uncomfortable with the superhero movies they've been seeing, right? That was his version of satire, to make people feel uncomfortable with superhero movies in the same way that Moore tried to deconstruct superheroes in comics in the 80s. But I think he just failed to understand that by doing that, he is saying something completely different about violence, about people, about those characters.
Yeah, that they are literally supermen, mensch, that they are kind of have abilities.
Mensch.
Yeah, and this brings us to the scene that you wanted to talk about, but I've done side by sides with, which is Night Owl 2 and the Silk Spectre, right? Which is basically after the Silk Spectre has a fight, which is also and I'm just going to talk about it, not show it. The Silk Spectre has a fight with Dr. Manhattan, which is portrayed very differently in the comic than in the movie, which is that Dr. Manhattan splits himself into multiple people while they're having sex, right? In the movie, he actually specifically says, I thought you liked this, as in they've done it before. In the comic, she is like, what are you doing? And he says, I thought you might like this, right? It's more non-consensual in the comic, and not in a bad, like, when she says no, he listens, but it's not something they've tried before. In the comic, it's more like, well, she used to like this and now she doesn't. So it puts us a little bit more on Dr. Manhattan's side. It's very subtle, but it's basically what happens after that she decides to leave him is that she runs to Night Owl and they decide to go for a walk, right? And then this is intercut with Dr. Manhattan going to a chat show where he's going to get interrogated over the fact that he called, as we learn, causes people cancer. Again, look at the beauty. And this is just, I just want to marvel.
Actually thinks he does.
Yeah. I just want to marvel at the beauty of the parallel storytelling that the comic can do in the medium, which is, again, the blue frames, the colors tell us what is the parallel storyline, which is him getting ready. As basically the Silk Spectre talks to Night Owl about her breakup with him, and he probably doesn't really care. He doesn't really care about anyone. He's probably just, it's mundane, and him getting dressed is like, it's a very good intercutted parallel storytelling. And they've kept elements of that in this sequence, the intercutting, and I've cut them out because otherwise we'll just be here for 3 minutes watching the intercutting of the scene, right? But it ends, there's a subtle plot difference, was essentially Night Owl is having someone repair his door that's been broken by Rorschach. And then they say, oh, you should get a cab. But in the comic, they changed that, and it's Night Owl suggesting to Silk Spectre that they should get a cab. The emotional charge of this scene is different, and it's cut short because it's fucking long on screen, right? This speaks to violence and its relationship with theme, right? So she says, I'm in a bad mood. In the movie, in the comic, it kind of plays with, she's just like, she's happy to go for bad. In the movie, they play it as if they're deliberately trying to pick a fight. You can talk over it, Shaz.
Can I?
Yeah, I'm playing the music. Yeah, of course you can.
Maybe we should get a cab. These are bad neighborhoods.
Yeah, well, I'm in a bad mood.
She kind of looks over it. We stay with them, and look at this. This is them kind of going, look at her like, hey, let's go down the alley. That's not in the comic. She's choosing to go to an alley, and these guys follow them. She kind of looks over the shoulder. Great, they followed us, right? In this, it's a lot more. In the movie, they're playing it as she is in a bad mood. She's picking a fight.
Yeah, and she's inviting the violence. I would say, in the defense of the book, I feel like that is somewhat in there, that both Dan and her are trying to reconnect over old times and wanting to rekindle what it felt like back when they knew each other.
I agree, except I think it's subconscious.
Yeah, okay.
I completely agree that they are trying to pick a fight. However, I think that it's conscious in the thing, and whereas Moore's point is that they've been doing this for so long that they almost can't reconnect and have that sexual chemistry without it, but that has been repressed.
Yeah, and that's a difference to character in that it's subconscious expressing itself versus consciously looking for something. And that then, because they're changing the character motivations or the character awareness, they're having the exact same actions, but then how they feel about it, what they do about it, is then impacting how the audience feels about what they're watching. So you can see from the panels. Yeah.
Do you want me to hit play now? Because it continues paralleling.
But you can see from the panels, the red is not making you feel good as a reader about the violence that you're watching, right? Whereas, fuck, man, the compound fractures and the blood. And look, and that's Snyder going, I'm trying to make people feel bad about the violence that we're seeing, but he's not. He's fetishizing it.
Look how much they do not emphasize the specific actions and about how amazing they are at this. In this fight, they are amazing. And then they do that. And this, I want to bring into a little point about worldview. Like this little thing with the knife.
Yeah.
Like the little cut through him. Slow-mo, like this is not, look at what the panels Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons have chosen to show.
They haven't chosen to show people stabbing each other in the neck.
Like knives are a part of it, but as you say, it's not fetishizing it, right? And the other thing I noticed when we went through this, which brings into like my presentation of worldview, and where because in Watchmen, all the characters get an opportunity to speak what their worldview is, how they think it works.
Yeah.
So at this moment, they've lifted a different part of the comic. So there's definitely like, oh, wait, actually, no, I'm not going to lead into worldview yet, right? Because it brings into what you observed, because there's the resolution of the fight, right? Which in this, in the comic ends with him getting really frustrated, and they standing over, the show's over, and they're like panting, like, look how, like her having a leg, sexual, right? Yeah. And the comic is deliberately frame this as a sexual come on, the mob's getting aroused, right? Yeah. It's deliberately trying to make you read this as a sexual thing, but not as like
being critical of it. Like these guys can only get off after beating people up.
And in the movie, it's also that choice that they have not deliberately led the audience there with aroused as a commentary, and the text telling you that you're meant to see it and then kind of giving you a degree of irony. In the movie, this is where Dr. Manhattan loses his shit. and then he loses his shit, transports everyone. Like it's like he orgasms. He orgasms. And then it cuts to those guys, as opposed to it being they're getting aroused and they're sexually frustrated. It is a difference. In the previous thing, it's they're sexually frustrated and they don't kind of like fulfill their relationship. And Dr. Manhattan's the same thing. And then he kind of climaxes this. They've done the sexual gag, but missed the point, right? Which is the fact is that this just gets them hot and bothered, but they don't kind of resolve it.
Yeah. I mean, look, Julio has called out in the chat the fact that in the sex scene, which is ridiculous in the book, the sex scene between Night Owl and Silk Spectre is ridiculous in the book as it is in the film. But what the book doesn't have is fucking Leonard Cohen. Is it Leonard Cohen's version of Hallelujah?
Yeah, I think it is.
Buckley's. Anyway, Hallelujah blaring over the top of it as if these two sad, impotent individuals who need violence to get off coming together is something to celebrate.
All right. This is like, I'm going to, just because it's in the PowerPoint and I've got stuff to show.
Yeah.
But when looking at it, they made a choice in this scene that he's talking about violence and Dr. Manhattan is talking about how he perceives the world, that there's no difference between living or dead. It's the same manner of atoms. That is something he says very early in the comic. He actually says it in the first issue, in the pilot. We very clearly understand who Dr. Manhattan is, right? And his worldview. And in the film, they've moved it later, right? So in the comic, it's when Rorschach turns up the first time we as the audience run into Dr. Manhattan and talks to him about the comedian. And the comedian says, he says, you're not too concerned. And he says, a living body and a dead body contain the same number of particles. Structurally, there's no discernible difference. Why should I be concerned? So we know he's kind of indifferent to the death. They've made the decision to push it later in the film, right, to this talk show. And there's a key editorial decision, but it's something I think a writer can have control over.
Cancer.
You're suggesting I was the cause.
From where I'm standing, it's starting to look pretty conclusive.
Even if that's the case, it's irrelevant. A live human body and a deceased human body have the same number of particles.
This makes it seem as though the death of these punks in the alley doesn't actually matter because their lives are pointless and meaningless, since we're not. The way that they use it as essentially exposition is really problematic.
It's commentary on their lives. Their lives don't really matter. And it's not holding on Dr. Manhattan. It doesn't reinforce that this is Dr. Manhattan's worldview. It actually makes us sympathize with him, and it makes it feel like it's a commentary on the action, as opposed to this is who he is. Whereas in the comic, the panel is him. Look, the panel is I'm gonna bring it up again. The panel's a fucking close up of him saying this shit, right? Yeah. It's clearly like you need to associate. This is who he is, associated with his character. They're actually distancing the character from that worldview, right? Because I think one of the portrayals of Dr. Manhattan in the movie, separate from the comic is more complicated portrayal of it, but they kind of set him up as inhuman a lot earlier in the comic. And in the film, they're kind of playing with his humanity a little bit more. All right. And that brings me back to the TV show, if there's anything else we want to say about the TV show, because there's a very similar worldview given in a more human manner by Cal, because Cal, as we will learn after this, is Dr. Manhattan, but he espouses a worldview, but in more human terms, that is actually very similar.
Heaven is pretend.
So where is he then?
Well, before Uncle Joe was born, he was nowhere. Didn't exist. Then he was a baby. Then he was a child. Then he was an adult. Then he died. Now he's nowhere. Again.
And that kind of, what I like about that is it connects Cal to the worldview. It's almost the first clue from a character point of view that Cal is Dr. Manhattan. And it's done through like character espousing sympathetic worldview.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't think there's time in this particular live stream to talk into how much I want to rave about how I think the HBO show nails Dr. Manhattan's character as an extension of Alan Moore's writing. But one of the things that bother me about the Zack Snyder show is Billy Crudup has been directed to say almost every word apologetically. His performance is apologetic. Whereas to me, the whole point of Dr. Manhattan is he doesn't apologize for fucking anything because he doesn't understand why anyone's upset with him, because they just can't see what he sees.
Yeah, there's only one moment in the whole comic where I think that he sort of has this moment that almost changes his worldview. Well, and we don't actually see it happen. We see him explaining it in post to Sil Spectre was like, oh, I thought X, and then I actually changed my mind and realized this. But he never apologizes for that. He just simply says, oh, I had a perception switch, essentially.
Yeah, I'm flipping through the comic because I didn't have the luxury of Stu's digital version, or rather, I'm a Luddite that I didn't bother to access Stu's digital version.
I think that it's very interesting in the characterization that I think that the show is the most human of all three. So the movie is the least human, weirdly. The comic, there's a middle ground where he's not a human. He is a god, and he has that super detached thing, but he does have the moment where he changes and recognizes what's important about Laurie is also what's important about all of humanity. But then in the show, we actually see that it's inspiration and in humanity and Angela over a long period of time, over his reading, over his inhabiting this specifically Black human body that finally imbues him with a sense of why humanity is important and an understanding of what humanity means, which I think is really lovely. Like, there is actually growth within that, and which is why I think the TV show is the most human. And I don't think we can detach that from the fact that he is in explicitly a Black body for that long. Like, he is explicitly in a place which is not a god body, which is not a body that where he was initially born in, what he's in the comic before he is impacted by the accident and becomes Dr. Manhattan. It's something that the world has always treated as something subhuman, something to impose its will upon. And that is something that is really interesting about the retconning. This one is retconned. Interpretation of growth of Dr. Manhattan's body and his growth in humanity.
Okay, I thought you were going into the Hooded Justice retcon.
No, not. And see, that one I'm not 100% sure is a retcon, and that's it's a reinterpretation, but you can't prove it's a retcon.
Yeah, because there was a gap. I mean, Damon Lindelof has gone on many podcasts saying that Hooded Justice thing was a gap. It was a deliberate mystery that wasn't answered, and I'm just choosing to fill the gap.
It's like changing Hermione's race in the theater play when Hermione was changed to be a Black girl. A lot of people said you can't do that, and actually, which again, let's not get into J.K. Rowling's retconning of her universe. But my point being is that she came out and said, where does it say in the books that she's white? It does not. This is something that is assumed. This is something that has been translated. It's something, etc. But in the graphic novel, it's never said that he's white, ever. Whereas we do see Dr. Manhattan presented as a white man. And also, there's a short gap of time between his actual humanity and his turning into Dr. Manhattan. There's not really a space for growth. What we have in the show is this long, explicit amount of time where he does experience the world as a human to some extent, and also has Angela, and that grows his humanity, which is really interesting.
I kind of want to wrap off this part of it, and then I think, if depending on Chaz's time, we might be able to barrel through some of your other observations. But I think what's interesting, what occurred to me while you guys were talking, is that given circumstances include. So what's cool, I think, about it is useful for screenwriters, given circumstances, the given circumstances of the world, and the challenge for writers is how do you present those circumstances to the audience? And there's almost a whole podcast in that. But there's also worldview, how the character thinks the world works is a given circumstance. It's a fact. the fact for Dr. Manhattan, an immutable, unchangeable fact, and one of the ideas of given circumstances, these are things that you cannot change. This is what the writer has said is your world. You know, your world, your book is set in this era. Your time, place is this. That if you're interpreting the play without making those, you can choose to change them, but they should be facts of the world. How the character believes the world works is a fact of who they are, right? Rorschach's psychology is a given circumstances. The comedian psychology is a given circumstances. Dr. Manhattan's view of the world is a given circumstances, but so is race, and their experience of the world is a given circumstance of that. And I think that is what is interesting about Hooded Justice, is that his experience of the world and why he has chosen to wear that outfit is a given circumstance of who they are. Right. And as much as it's a mystery, Damien Lindelof has done a good job of going, if we take this as a fact of the character that we know, that they wear this outfit, why do they choose to wear that? Why do they choose to hide who they are? You know, you could see it as perception of homosexuality, but what's his face? Captain Metropolis is out, you know, visibly out. And I can't speak to this as being queer, and I wonder if you relate to it more, but that idea of presenting who you are and stuff, it seems like it's a given circumstances of Hooded Justice. And what they're playing with is that. And then it's how we present how does the audience catch up to the character in understanding what motivates them?
Yep. And I think all of that is interesting, particularly in how Manhattan essentially switches on from one to the other. Like his given circumstances, sort of, it's a switch moment from a writing perspective as well as from a character perspective, where you can present him two different ways, which is super interesting. You don't get that option. You don't get that potential very much as a writer. Anyway, what was the next? I think you're right. Like, there's a lot more that we can say about that, and there's definitely like bookloads that I could say in terms of Captain Metropolis and and things like that.
Okay, so the given circumstance, the Hooded Justice thing, and I can talk about it quickly if no one wants to argue with me. What is interesting about it is the given circumstances of Hooded Justice, the person in the real world, quote unquote real world, of the Watchmen TV show, is that he was a black man that grew up and reacted out of racial violence. The given circumstances for the people within the world, but it's been presented to them, is that Hooded Justice is a white man, right? Mm-hmm. And there is the reveal, and when we edit this podcast and I put the video, there is the reveal in the American Hero story where Hooded Justice finally reveals who he is, and he's a pretty American boy, right? And so it's about the part of changing who the Hooded Justice is. What's great about it is the show is treating the reality that he is Will Reeves as it's real and significant for the character, and that people's perception of that event in the world is consistent with our assumptions as an audience. And I'm assuming it's an assumption. Assuming it's an assumption. Great English there, right? But it's speaking to our inherent biases, and they're playing into that. So they're acknowledging the given circumstances for the audience is that we're going to assume that a superhero is probably a white dude, right? And somehow that enables them to do it. And then when it's explained to us with the only way that Hooded Justice can do with what he is doing is by hiding his identity, we understand it. Like, this is exploiting. That's what makes it so powerful. Is it's intersection of the audience's worldview, the character's worldview, but the other character's perception of their own world. Does that kind of make sense?
And this goes back to what you were saying earlier about actors reading through reading through things and doing that as a given circumstance. But it also, some of that's going to be within the action lines. They're going to have to write some of what you just said into the action lines for that full sort of dramatic irony and for that full impact to have on it. And I think I touch on this in the visuals, where when we're watching the American story, American Hero story, the visuals are portrayed one way and we're watching it happen in reality, and they're directed by different people. Like, the episodes are directed by different people, which means that within the action lines, you've got to talk about, we want it to look like this while you're writing, because you need the director to understand what impact that's going to have later once the reveal happens. So from a screenwriting perspective, you've got to explain some of that a bit.
One thing I think, given circumstances, is useful, and I'm not going to speak specifically to this project, but I'm working on something now that's going into production, and the script that we have to write for the reader, as in the people that are reading, this is how the audience experience, and the script that we're writing for the crew has to be different, because we've got to do things like what this is, because this is a still from the film. Hooded Justice there, they've done a very good job of hiding his hands and stuff. He's a black man, right? They're just having a hint of it there that you won't tell unless you know, but they've tried to, and it's not an Easter egg. It's
but
just
except he deliberately spray painted his eyes so that he would appear as white.
So they've worked it, but I think they've kind of done the subtlety because they're making this as true. The character is trying to hide his identity. I just wanted to come back to that comment because that photo, because I think they've done a good job. What I would like to do here is, I think I've wrapped up the aspects of the given circumstances. I am happy if Chaz has got time for Mel to quickly barrel through her other observations with me shutting the fuck up.
And me too.
And she can kind of, because they're great observations. I just don't.
The straight white guys will be quiet for a second.
Oh, is this the one about Hooded Justice then?
Is it? I was just going.
I was thinking your visual, like how
writing transitions. Do you have something to say about Hooded Justice?
To be honest, I think I will probably write a supplemental thing with my notes on that. Let's get to the writing of the visuals. Can you put up whatever? I don't know what order they came up in. So
it was writing transitions, and now
writing transitions. Okay, so in writing transitions, I find it really interesting in that, this is just a sample from the comic. It's literally a transition from a scene to a scene where Alan Moore would have written, I want it to happen like this, because you've got the flash that happens when your Silk Spectre is looking at this old photograph. You change to the photo having a flash, and then bang, it takes us into them blinking and saying, oh. So it's really interesting. You've got transitions that are written on a page versus transitions that are written in the TV show. Now, obviously, a lot of transitions aren't written in per se. Like, directors, for the most part, decide how they're going to transition scenes. However, just like I said, that some of them, because you've got different directors who are doing different things, and you've got a lot of symbolic visuals that they wouldn't necessarily understand are important. If I'm directing episode 3 and there's a scene with eggs, I don't necessarily understand that in episode 9, eggs are going to have this massive, massive impact. So we
don't know the given circumstances for the symbolic structure of the whole film.
Exactly. Yeah, because you've got all these different things. So I think that there's something to extrapolate. You can sort of work backwards. Watching the show, you can realize, some of these visuals were actually had to have been written in as a big important thing. So writing transitions and then writing visuals. So sorry, real quick, let me finish the transition thing and then I'll do the visuals. If you watch the first 10 minutes or so of the TV show, the transitions are all J-cuts. This probably wasn't written in, but I do find it really interesting that we go to Tulsa, we're watching Tulsa happen, and then suddenly we've got a modern song that starts playing over the credits, and then we cut to the modern song.
That could be written in, though. That is something that is in those kind of pre-laps are in the control of the writer. So
could be,
may not be the director.
And then when that episode, we get Future's, I think, Crushed Up starts playing over. And then at the end of that scene, we start hearing Angela's audio before the scene is finished, before it cuts to Angela. We start hearing Oklahoma before, and that I'm guessing is definitely written in because Black Oklahoma. The song really explicitly comes into play, so I'm guessing that probably was written in. That all of the songs from the musical sort of come into play throughout the episode. Then we, at the end of Black Oklahoma, before that scene finishes playing out, we start hearing Angela before we actually see her. The fact that it happens in all four, and the fact that it's a time period transition to a spatial transition with a song that becomes super important and then loops back around to being the final song that plays over Judd Crawford hanging dead in a tree. I think these transitions were likely to have been written in. Yes, the director might have done maybe more of them, but I think they were probably written in. Or the editor, yeah. Well, but I tend to think that the director is usually directing the editor to do such, but
you're giving them TV production too much time.
I've been rescued too many times in the edit to discredit editors.
I fucking love editors, and often editors have come up with something much better than I would have when I'm directing. So it's true. But the collaborative process, it could have been the writer, could have been the editor, could have been the director, could have been all of the above. When it comes to writing, the vision for the same.
Yeah, it's the vision for the show. Oh, is this an excuse to change slides?
Yes. So now so the visuals that are written in, there's so much symbolism. And I think that some of this was written in that they would have said, look, eyes are a big thing. So these two bowls are laid out looking like eyes. Whether or not that was the idea to make this a symbol to Night Owl, I don't know. But I think that some of these visuals were likely written in from the start. They said, we want the visual to look like X. And then obviously it's up to the director how that happens. But I think that writing the visuals, because the eyes are apparent in every episode. There's close-ups on eyes. There's symbols of eyes. There's a transition, which I think is the next slide, which is one of my favorite transitions in the whole thing. Reminds me very much of Tarsem Singh's The Fall. So if you watch this and how important this is beautiful. I'll just shut the fuck up and let it play out. So you've got close up on eyes, close up on eyes. And then the transition down into the courtroom where Veidt is being tried. But there's eye imagery in every single episode, and I believe I know we've got the card which says all the writers. There's several writers, and I think there's probably 7 distinct directors. So they clearly would have made clear in the action lines, we want eyes to be a recurring motif. Whether or not they put that in every scene, there's definitely something.
Whether or not that's in the script, that would have had to have been meticulously planned.
Absolutely.
That's not something that someone was like, oh, let's just find this in the edit.
This looks cool. This transition looks cool. No, like this is very much something that they planned out. And I think that's like probably a showrunner thing.
They would have had to have built those stained glass windows to
or had
like
a very
eyes.
good scout.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
I do have a credit on the Watchmen pilot on IMDb, by the way. Cracks me up.
So real quick, can you just go to that last writing visual scene, which I know that one. Which I know I touched on, but the fact that this is so explicitly reversed, you've got the primary colors, you've got this heroic swooping in to save the day, and in the other end, you've got black and white. It's brutal and painful. He's escaping out the window. Directed by 2 different people because it's in 2 different episodes, which means that when they were writing, they had to say, we want this to be the mirror image of this in these 3, 5, however many different ways. And then the directors and the showrunner would have coordinated it. But this is within the writing. This is a thing that in the script they knew was coming and had to be really explicit about. We want the American hero story to be filmed in this particular way,
and
so that it
to save the
thing coming later.
But like, unironically, I don't know how much the show made this decision, but that American hero story retelling of Hooded Justice's origin is the bit that feels the most like the Snyder movie of all the HBO show. It's got the slow-mos, the beautiful lighting. Yeah, I'm not going to accuse it
because I think Lindelof doesn't. I think Lindelof appreciates certain things about Snyder's film, so I think it's a slightly loving jab in the ribs a little bit. But I think it's acknowledging they have very different tones.
I actually think the violence in the TV show is closer to the portrayal of violence in the movie than it is to the violence in the comic
graphic novel.
Yeah. I think it's got a little bit more of that. We're going to enjoy it, like a little bit more like the Kick-Ass or a Verhoeven. I think the TV show makes it more Verhoeven. It's like we're slightly repulsed by it, but also titillated. Whereas I think it's largely just titillated in the TV
movie?
show.
In the movie.
Yeah, sorry, in the movie. No, yeah. I think what is interesting, just coming back to this, we didn't talk about it, but it's just an observation that's kind of like a bullet point. One of the key techniques of the comic is the intercutting with the Tales of the Black Freighter, which is a story with a comic within a comic, right? Of a black kid turns up at this newsstand, reads this comic that are pirate comics, and then we're watching it going, why am I watching this? It's coming back to the thematic question. Why am I watching this? And then ultimately get the answer that in some ways it parallels is like Ozymandias' Veet's storyline. It's his perception of what he's willing to sacrifice to save the world. And it's a comic within a comic. And I've been watching the ultimate cut because I haven't seen it, but in preparation for this, I've been watching the ultimate cut, which intercuts the animated version of the Black Freighter with the movie. And it's less effective because you're going from a kid reading a comic, right? So the transition is I'm reading a comic into a animated movie that's kind of got like connotations of Ninja Scroll, right? So it kind of removes you. What the TV show did that was clever is that they've done the same idea. What is the show within the show? And they made it a TV show about that is a retelling of the story that is part of the given circumstances of the comic and the world, but also how these how they influence our understanding of the world. So which I've mentioned, which is our perception of Hooded Justice being a white man changes the history, right? So, but that's a visual motive, and I think that is something that Snyder quite hasn't been able to do. That there is this level of look, I don't want to say what he doesn't want to do him because I've never met the guy, and it's possible like you just don't know what's going on behind the scenes. Yeah. But there is what the images mean and what the images look like, and you can be slavish to what the images look like and not what they mean, if you know what I mean. And or you can reinterpret something to a medium, and get what it means and find a different way to visually show it, which is the advantage that the TV show had is by being a sequel is they can abandon the need to be slavish to the text itself and then can borrow techniques. Right. Yeah. So where I want to end, if we can, because I think we're getting to the point. Oh fuck, we can definitely wrap this shit up. Like, is there like a broad base of like I think we've talked about the movie and the show. Is there a broad base of techniques that we can see that the show has taken from the comic that the movie didn't?
Yes.
And that's what's made it being more effective.
I love particularly in the edit, the way that it plays with time. And this is writing. This is definitely written. But if you look at how God walked into a bar, how the way that it cuts Dr. Manhattan's story and how he's talking about experiencing past and present, and it shows as it's telling. And nostalgia does this as well, somewhat when Angela takes the nostalgia, that's sort of the method of getting us there. But the way that it cuts...
the convenient narrative device that allows us to travel back in time.
But I've got two slides, and I'm not sure where they went in the actual keynote, sorry, but I've got two slides from the graphic novel, which is Dr. Manhattan's experience and how he's experiencing multiple sort of timelines at once.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I think I've got the Rorschach and Puns and Food and Eggs, and I've got the story mechanics and depiction of time in the narrative.
That one. The Rorschach and Eggs is, I just love that bit. But the story mechanics one. So the TV show, God Walks into a Bar, takes this sequence, which is a longer sequence than this. I think in the comics, it's actually about 6 pages, where it's a bit of a disjointed but sensical depiction of how Dr. Manhattan experiences time. And it's really beautiful. One of my favorite things in the whole comic is that because he's mentioned before the cool beer and the girl handing him a cool beer, and he brings it back into this depiction of his understanding. And this is actually probably for me his second most human moment in the comic, the first being when he's talking up on Mars about finally understanding humanity because of the chance that actually brings humans into existence.
And I'm not gonna I swear this is my one interruption, but I will say this is the one bit that Snyder absolutely fucking nails in the movie, just so that Julio doesn't claim that I didn't say anything nice about the movie.
Oh, I'm not saying that
sequence
this
in the movie is amazing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just am only studying it in terms of the book and the TV show. I'm not saying that I'm just saying technique wise, I think this is something that, and you can argue, and you might be right, that this is something that you're simply enabled to do because he has 9 hours. He takes, I say the writers of Watchmen take an entire hour and are able to devote it to this intercutting and disjointed spatial interpretation and time interpretation of what the graphic novel does. And I think that is an incredibly interesting technique from a writing perspective, of being able to write these storylines and then chop them up and then see how they play out, and showing, not telling. It's giving the audience the experience of how Dr. Manhattan experiences time by letting us experience it out of joint and all at the same time, as much as we possibly can through a TV show. Because if we were to actually experience it all at once, it'd probably be closer to Veidt's sort of let's play 87 things on different TV shows, which Elementary, the TV show, also riffs on by having Sherlock essentially do the Ozymandias thing and being able to absorb them all at once. But other than that, something that would be essentially a century overwhelm, this is as close as we can get. And I think that technique, screenwriting wise, is incredibly well executed in HBO's show.
But I'd say yes, it does, but they're also very careful on what they withhold for narrative purposes. Like in the God Walks Into a Bar episode, he talks about how, you know, it's going to end with a fight and his death and blah blah blah. But then when you actually get to that point playing out in real time as it's experienced by the audience, because it's as Angela's experience, he knows exactly what's going to happen. He has told her what's going to happen. Exactly. This is what I'm getting to. The narrative structure as a filter through which we experience all these things. So the audience has been told this. He has experienced it. We haven't been shown it, right? Visually from his point of view. He's just told us about it. And it's only as Angela's experiencing it. We still have, I mean, I say I certainly experienced like oh my God, because him telling Angela this, does she have the power to change it? Is this like one of those time paradox things where that suddenly made me hopeful that she was going to be able to rescue him? And the film plays with that. Whereas, sorry, not the film, the TV show plays with that. It toys with our emotions by it tells us that stuff in dialogue in the previous episode, and then in the climactic episode, actually I think it's episode 8, but it shows us from Angela's point of view. And in choosing the narrative structure that way, it controls exactly how we feel about it. And it still made me go, I don't know what's going to happen here, even though Dr. Manhattan knows what's going to happen and has told us what's going to happen. I still don't know what's going to happen because of how they've structured it in terms of point of view, in terms of all those things. And it's only when Dr. Manhattan's kind of inevitable view of time is told to us that we kind of, your heart breaks in that moment.
It's really well executed. The other thing that you reminded me of just now is with that weird paradox about how Will didn't find out until she asked, and that creates that sort of circular thing, which in writing is a bit of a mind fuck, the same way that Dr. Manhattan's experience of time is a bit of a mind fuck. Like it's like trying to conceptualize eternity, whereas you feel like you can get there and then it sends you spinning. It's really, really beautifully done. For sure.
But to me, that is so fascinating, because that's actually Dr. Manhattan choosing cause and effect. His view of time and his view as a character feels to me that he doesn't have choice. Like he's just living out things as they are supposed to play out. But by him saying
Newtonian physics,
right?
which seems like a weird, not Dr. Manhattan, should be more quantum physics, but whatever.
Yeah, but him
unpredictability,
making that decision, it works perfectly well from the audience point of view. I'm going to, in the past, tell something that I'm being told about in the future, and by that setting off the cause and effect that makes the conversation I'm having in the present possible. Like that whole time paradox, they make it work visually in the show, but it gives Dr. Manhattan a sense of cause and effect that he does not, as a character, see himself as having.
Oh, that's good. That's a fascinating observation.
All right, man, I could talk all day about Dr. Manhattan in the show and how they nailed it. They fucking nailed it.
I look, hey, you've got one observation, and I'm going to give you permission to say it at the end, which is your lack of imagination. That's your permission.
Oh god, the best, my favorite thing, and it's about the show, is that they see Dr. Manhattan as not having imagination. He's a being of limitless creative potential, and what they understood about him is he is a being of limitless creative potential that has evolved from a human who was actually quite boring and unimaginative. And only in
He's the son of a watchmaker.
Yeah.
Literally, all I know how to do is make things tick forward in precision.
And like, Stu, and you putting the side-by-side videos, I'm having more and more understanding of how amazingly they did this in the show. So for example, in the book, Dr. Manhattan steadily wears less and less clothes because he's becoming detached from humanity. He doesn't care, but he still retains a human body because he doesn't have an imagination to physicalize himself as anything other than as his human body. And
which is something the movie does not do. That he's basically weighing out the whole time, right?
Yep.
And that is actually a very big difference. I think when we first meet Dr. Manhattan in the comic, he's still he's naked, and then we use that to track time. Is like his level of clothing. Which is like, what level of isolation are you is relative to how much clothing you're choosing to wear on a Zoom.
But then in the show, when he comes back after having spent X number of years as Cal, she says to him, "You've kept his face," right? And I think she sees it, Angela Abar, sees it as, oh my God, you know, you loved your time as being Cal and you're still keeping it. Whereas I'm like, oh fuck, he's just lived in this body for so long. He can't think of another way to present himself, right? And it makes so much fucking sense. Like, that is the one insight that Damon Lindelof and the writers of The Watchmen have taken from the book that is not expressly mentioned in the book, that just makes so much sense, is that he doesn't have imagination. He has limitless power, but not imagination. He leaves at the end of the book to say, I'm going to go and create life. And one of the most fucking brilliant things they do in the film is he goes to Jupiter, in the TV show, is he goes to Jupiter and create life. But the only life he can create is an exact replica of one of his seminal childhood experiences, because he doesn't have imagination.
And the show goes out of its
cosmic power, imagination.
I love that you referenced
So that's the Aladdin reference. I could see that. You've got kids. You know where this is coming from.
What's your excuse, Mel?
God kids.
You're like, I'm just really into Disney.
God kids, and Robin Williams' delivery is just impeccable. Has always stuck with me. Like, anyway, yeah.
Okay, all right. So I actually think we're kind of getting near the end. Did you want to talk about Rorschach and eggs?
So okay. If you want to put up that slide, I'll talk about two aspects of it real quick. The first is that, going back to your talking about the bean juice and his puns and all of that sort of thing, I love this. I love this moment. I love it in terms of the graphic novel, because it's another riff on the bean juice and how he uses food and how he uses seemingly mundane things as this long bit that he runs with people that he's terrorizing. However, I also like it because I think that the biggest item that comes back and back and back, obviously, throughout the show is an egg. And this is one of the most explicit uses of an egg within the actual graphic novel. And I don't know how much of this was intentional via Lindelof latching onto an egg as the thing. But that can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, because he literally does throughout that scene. He sits there, he pulls the eggs out of the carton. They're beautifully depicted throughout all of these things. He cracks it, he slurps it, you see the yolk and the white and all of that sort of thing. So I just love that there's a little thing within the graphic novel that clearly gets pulled out, extrapolated, and run throughout the entire show. You see it in so many ways, both from like the literal when Dr. Manhattan back in the graphic novel is talking about humanity, he does talk about the odds of any one particular egg being fertilized, which the show talks about, which the show uses literally, and then which end up I mean, when we are introduced to Angela, it's literally with her using eggs as a science experiment. And then in the end, with her eating it and it becoming the crux of that Schrodinger's swimming pool of whether or not it actually happened. It all comes down to the egg. And I love it. It's brilliant.
All right. I think the swimming pool is actually a really great place to end, but I think it actually comes back to the overly complicated screenwriting diagram, which you only understand by buying the Draft Zero book or signing up to our Patreon.
You've got to, it's a great diagram and you worked very hard on it. We've got to show it.
I should make it more egg-like. I should just make it like more oval. It's not a triangle, it's an egg.
Well,
and then it's like, this is the yolk.
Yellow in the middle. Yep.
Yeah, this is the yolk. All right. Okay. So I'm using this as an opportunity for kind of us to do wrap up. Because we've kind of like started here, wandered in a whole bunch of directions, and then use this. But I actually think that I'll say it now, and then we can debate the meaning of the ending. I think part of what the ending's got, why it feels like Schrodinger's, which I'm not saying, the swimming pool, is that we don't see consequence. And the one thing on this document we don't have, and I realize is an absence, is consequence. Worldview, motivation, and action is informed by consequence, cause and effect, right? This is cause and there's an effect which feeds back into what characters do, right?
But don't you think that's just more character action?
Yeah, character action. But if you do something and it fails, it's going to change your action. If it succeeds, then it's going to continue your action. It's informed by worldview, right? But our understanding of also whether characters are smart or stupid or what they're doing is informed by whether or not they succeed or fail, right? Does that kind of make sense? This document needs to be like 5-dimensional. It needs to be like a fucking crazy thing that I spin around and we all look at, but which is why a diagram is stupid, but because it's more organic. But there is this thing that our understanding of our worldview is informed by what works and what doesn't, and our motivation, our action. And when something doesn't work and we're persistent in trying to prove that it works or not, you know, the Rorschach and the mirror looking glass continue in the face of all odds to hold to their worldview, right, is informed by the fact that their worldview doesn't align with reality. And reality, we should determine, is the outcome, right? That the outcome of their action and their action is ultimately informed by their worldview and their motivation will feed back in, right? Blah, 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 blah. I'm trying to use this to come back. Is there any kind of learning lessons in the in the context or the lens of this diagram that we can relate from the show and the movie and the comic before we kind of talk about the end of the series? Because I think the end of the series kind of in some ways summarizes everything, which is a reflection of my worldview. So
the biggest things that I've learned from this episode, sadly, are not from what the show did amazingly right, but actually how Snyder adapted the comic, which is just seeing how you take the exact same character actions, the exact same character motivation, the exact same worldview, and you play it in a different order or present it in a different tone, you change the meaning of the piece.
Well, the one thing we didn't talk about in depth, and we don't need to, but one of the things that they changed the order about was the comedian being a sexual predator, right? In the movie, they've changed that, and that's going to change what it means to be investigating the murder of someone who was a piece of shit. Right. What does it mean to be doing a murder investigation of a piece of shit? What actually says Rorschach does not give a fact that he's a piece of shit. As he, in fact, what he says in the comic, which they took out of the movie, is that there's a particular phrase, moral lapses. Whatever the moral lapses of the comedian, his murder's worth investigating, which should, for an audience now, particularly now, get alone 1987, but particularly now, go, oh God, like we're going to overlook the moral lapses of this character in order to determine who he's killing, because we determine that he's worthy of
investigation,
of retribution and justice, because that he was I think that's a really interesting aspect.
Because of their personal connection to him, essentially. And because they can see themselves in him the way that most of us couldn't because of their specific connection through.
Oh yeah. Rorschach is closer to the comedian. I think in the comic, Rorschach is shown as closer in terms of worldview to the comedian than he is to certainly Night Owl, right?
The difference between Rorschach and the comedian is that the comedian finds the exact same worldview funny, and Rorschach does not find it funny.
Yeah, which is a worldview. It's actually both in the worldview. It's their perception of reality, and one makes them laugh, and one of them is like, must investigate further. Right. So I guess what we wanted to talk about at the beginning was these are kind of levers. And what's interesting in the adaptation is that these levers of character action, because this is all shit that the writer does. The writer controls the given circumstances. They control what the characters do. They control what the characters think, what they say. But that could also possibly be what they think, what they say. But the only way we get access to what they think is through narration. So naturally, stories like the Watchmen comic and the Watchmen movie, but not the show, give us access to what characters think is through narration. So it's ultimately what they say, which is how we presented the character. But there is a dialectic here. What the characters think and what they say can be separate, but that's getting very esoteric. And then what they learn, but character motivation sits in the middle. What why they do what they do, and then what we learn about that is separate. And then how we learn that multiplied by tone, right? So in terms of tone, we talked about like very subtle aspects of dialogue, tone, color tone, as in color palette, music choices, because there's no music in the comic.
Hallelujah.
Shot choices, right? Who you're choosing to emphasize in the shot, who not. We're just using these as flippant examples. We're not going to go through the fucking movie, but we did examples, with the hallelujah. Oh, look, they're choosing to show the crowd before they come in. This is a close-up. This is not. We're hanging on Dr. Manhattan. We're not. That is tone. I mean, it's narrative structure, but it's tone, right? How we learn it, what we learn when, and then how we learn it changes how we feel, right? So what the advantage of the TV show, which we acknowledged earlier, is they're not translating the material directly. So they can actually take, this is my weird takeaway, and hopefully it makes sense, is that they can take the tone and the narrative structure and the given circumstances and make this shit up in the middle. They can invent characters, they can invent what those characters do, what their motivation is and their worldview, while keeping the consistency with how you tell that story, the order in which you tell it and the circumstances that inform that story, but they can change the yoke.
Yeah. Which is how Lindelof has given an audience experience that is nothing like whatever Alan Moore would ever write, but without it feeling at all like of a piece with the given circumstances of Alan Moore's novel. Which is not, this is oversimplifying with a fucking flowchart, an astonishing a storytelling achievement.
Or maybe the flowchart is so amazing that this flowchart's astonishing.
Both. Both. It could be both.
Yeah. Continue, Chaz. I know I just...
No, that was broadly it. Like,
still haven't read the fucking shirt. This is
I think he's ignoring the fucking shirt. All right, like to bring it back around to the ending notes too. You said you had a specific question about the ending, particularly in terms of the writing.
Well, okay, because it affects how we feel is that we don't see consequence. And so what I'm trying to say is the yoke in the middle of character action, character motivation, character worldview is tied into consequence. That there is consequences from their actions, right? That and the narrative structure, when we learn about their consequences, that changes how we feel. Right?
Yes, I think you are correct, but I think the end is not about how we feel about the consequence. It's about how we determine who we are based on what we think the consequence is going to be. And that's what's so fascinating about the ending.
We have the same thing with Knives Out, how it ended with Marta having the choice over what happens to the family, but she doesn't take the choice. We don't see her take the choice. We don't know what the consequences are. The only important thing is that she has the choice.
So in terms of the ending with Angela, it's like, it's less about whether or not she has the power. For me, it's less about whether or not she has the powers and more what she is going to do with those powers.
Potentially, because
or what she would do had she had them.
Yeah, because the whole conspiracy is like fucking Dr. Manhattan wasted being Superman, right? And we can do better.
Oh yeah, the Keen, the Seventh Cavalry. Yeah, won his powers.
But it's not just the 7th Cavalry, it's Lady True as well. Like that's the 7th Cavalry conspiracy and Lady True's conspiracy. They both want Dr. Manhattan's powers, and they both think that they can do a better job at being Dr. Manhattan than Dr. Manhattan.
Because they have more imagination.
Yep. And they have an agenda, which he doesn't.
It's the same thing, right?
And sorry, my daughter is singing Happy Birthday on an iPad. Hold on one second.
Well, that we're going to have to pay for sure. YouTube will shut that shit down.
Yeah. Sorry, the stream's interrupted now. All those comic frames, all that stuff, fine. Your daughter singing the happy birthday is wow.
But then what it's saying is the whole fucking 9-hour TV show is about stealing Dr. Manhattan's powers and certain characters with more imagination taking Dr. Manhattan's powers. And then the end question is, what would Angela do with those powers?
Which is why I hope they don't make a second season.
Which chicken and egg that intended. If we circle back around to the first time we've met her, she's abusing her powers. Like she is the anti-hero, and she is someone that we side with, and yes, she is oppressed, and yes, in a lot of ways she does good things, but she starts by breaking into a guy's trailer, throwing him in her trunk, throwing him in the boot of her car, taking him to the cops, and then beating the shit out of him. So there's definitely something to be said for, do we think that she's quote unquote learned anything through this? Do we think the powers will change her, or do we think the narrative that she's experienced over these 9 hours and meeting her grandfather and learning about the intergenerational trauma that has affected her, etc., has actually changed her? Potentially. I mean, Dr. Manhattan learned and changed for the better since the events of the comics through now, although that's extra textual. Anyway, I think I love the fact that it ends on something that is intentionally and explicitly meant to generate this sort of discussion. Not just to reveal your worldview, but to actually poke at it and make you question it and make you interrogate it. I think that's the genius, and I think that doing a second season would undo all of that and ruin it. I wish that HBO, and I'm sure that this was an HBO thing and not a Lindelof thing, I wish that they had advertised this as a limited series. I think that ending is one of the most, I mean, granted, you should take this as someone who actually likes the Sopranos ending, so know that.
I love it too.
Isn't it great?
And Angel, the whole freeze frame.
Angel was great. Angel could have had another season, but it ended perfectly.
Well, they did in comic book form.
Well, yeah, so did Buffy, and that's just, it's a whole other thing. It's a whole other thing. But I think
we could do
most perfect endings.
We could do a comic book Draft Zero. This is about comics.
Actually, side by sides.
I have just reread Transmet and have a lot of things to say about it.
It's still my number one material I would love to adapt. Anyway,
so that's my take on the ending. Ta-da! Wrapped up.
I think that is as good a place to end it as any that we can keep on talking about.
Good, because I'm also running out of gin.
Yeah. Fucking 3 hour. This was supposed to be an hour and a half. My kids have been very fucking patient.
Thank you, Silly. Thank you, Basti.
So also thank you to our interns, two of which were here at the beginning. I don't know if they're still here, but Chris and Alex, thank you very much. And thanks to all of our amazing patrons who bring you more Draft Zero more often. And you are currently having more Draft Zero than there has ever been before. So maybe people will be dropping off the Patreon list by the second. But in particular, thanks to our amazingest patrons.
Chris Walker, Jack Smith, Jesse, Laurie, Crob Emmons, Matteo, it's cut off now, just Matteo. Matteo, you love correcting me. Always, Nick, Sandra, and Theus. Thank you for being our top tier Patreons. You're amazing. Quickly going to, I have no other comments on them. Live chat.
But thanks to the people who joined us in the live chat, particularly Julio and Stephanie, who have been prompting us as we go along. Thank you, Mel.
Thank you guys for having. I mean, I'm loved that you had me back, especially after, again, I think The Mandalorian turned into this same sort of marathon thing. But this has been super enjoyable, both the research and the actual recording and nerding out thereof. So
maybe we should do a podcast on Saga.
I would love it.
Page, I've not read it yet.
I can
Transmetropolitan.
You're setting yourself more homework.
So I've got all of Transmet there, and Saga's in the middle next to Sex Criminals. This is like the Vertigo image shelf behind.
I was going to say your personality.
Why the Last Man and Preacher as well. Anyway, it's all there.
All right. Cool. Is there any back matter we want to deal with?
It's been 3 hours, man.
You're done. We're done. All right. I'm going to stop the live stream now.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.
See ya.